Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I think the thesis itself that we're presenting or that we're talking about today, it's going to be a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to um, talk about like some things I understood from it, and because there's a lot I don't understand, and especially the more technical parts. I think we can. I have some intuitive explanations of it, so that we can like at least have some guideposts to, you know, on our own we can read it and kind of explore it more. But I think, yeah, the conversation we should have, I think, should be more about the implications for our project, right? What we've been discussing as kind of political economy and understanding basically how what we've been talking about is the loss of information that happens when we shift from value to prices. So I want to focus on that, or bring this conversation to that topic. But as for what I've prepared, it's mainly just an overview of the concepts in this dissertation, right? This thesis. Okay, so yeah.
Just before you go into this, because the first thing that I had a really kind of it's this like the third time I find an author who, or a perspective on the issue of generativity, where you don't link emergent properties to the idea that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, but almost like the whole is smaller than the sum of the parts, right? Like you lose something. That guy, I really like, the Terence Deacon guy. He also suggests this, that part of the problem with people trying to explain the emergence of new levels of reality, like, you know, forms out of inorganic matter, life out of non-living stuff, is that people try to understand that whole as being larger than the sum of the parts, and then they ask, where does this excess come from? And then we're trapped. And then he says, but the trick is that you actually get further, like what's pushed through is constraints. It's not like new matter. So the emergence of constraints or reductions, that's the thing that is actually happening. So it is actually a loss. The move from a lower level to a higher level is more a matter of reducing than expanding, right? So matter can move in like a ridiculous amount of ways, but a form can only move in restricted ways. And a living system is even further restricted, or has a new quality of restrictions. So for him, this sort of upper movement is actually a movement of a whole that is smaller than the sum of the parts, not a whole that is bigger than the sum of the parts. And I feel like this thesis really brings that counterintuitive idea also. Like, yeah, you want to talk about generativity as a sort of like intuitively as being connected with nonlinearity and like richer systems, and not with loss of exactness or loss of information, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a similar weird intuition, I think.
Yeah, I see what you mean now. Does loss mean there was more information, or does it mean, because yeah, like you said, actually a larger space may not have more information, because if a larger space involves less constraints and information comes from constraints.
Yeah, exactly. Right? People confuse, let's say, confuse information and just randomness, you know, like, so you actually, let's say you increase the capacity of a motor, by restricting how much the parts can move. A motor where parts have free space to move, it actually has less power. It's less capable of, turning energy into mechanical power than one that is actually more restricted in what it can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So loss of information is not, let's say, that's for me the counterintuitive thing. I think the intuition about generative effects is that they are in excess to the systems that compose them. But I think that in this thesis, this interactional effects, they're actually, let's say, they're a function of a loss. So that's slightly different. And second, that you get this, it plays on this common topic already that freedom is not the contrary of constraint, right? On the contrary. Degrees of freedom sometimes are the inverse of actual capacity, right?
Yeah, I think this is a good point to make. I think we should read this basic thesis here. It's not about going from some more information to less information, but it's actually about, I think the theme that he introduces, which is related to what you're saying, is obstruction.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we want to have is a theory of, a general theory of obstruction, meaning something that blocks or something that prevents the phenomenon to line up with each other when they're glued together, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there must be some mechanism or some interaction happening that is non-trivial or not so easily deduced from the parts. Yeah. But yeah, the idea is that this generativity, this interaction between parts, can be formalized as an obstruction of some kind, as something preventing a certain closure or preventing a certain additive property to hold. That's the key. And this obstruction doesn't necessarily lead to this idea that the original space is bigger or has more information. It just means that the obstruction is real, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it all turns on how we interpret the notion of a hole in a space, right? You can think of a hole in a space as like, oh, loss of information, because it's not space. But in another sense, it actually gives you information. Holes are actually a form of information about a space. So yeah, it's whether we go negative or positive on that interpretation, that I think that leads to the different readings of this thesis. Yeah. Already in this first slide here, I wanted to show a simple example of what an interactional effect is. So imagine you have these two graphs here, and I want to get from one green point to the other green point. It's clear that I can't do that when these two graphs are separated, but when I glue the two graphs together along the red, I form this one on the right, and suddenly I'm able to make a path where before I couldn't, right? So imagine that this happened, but all you had were the green points. So the green points would be something like the phenomenon, and the graphs, the white and the red stuff would be something like the system. That from later on we'll explain what that is. But so the idea is, from a certain perspective, you're getting something that wasn't found in any of the two original systems. and you're only able to see that once you've glued them together. So once you've combined them. So maybe a way to say it is the set of all paths that are possible in system 1 and the set of all paths that are possible in system 2, if you add them together, they don't equal the set of all paths when you glue these two graphs together, right? You actually get a new path that wasn't found in either of the two. So this is kind of the idea, right? Like you have some information here. We call like the information can be called set of paths, right? And you would expect that if I add two things together, if I add the information of A to the information of B, that that this would be all the information of the, so if this is A and this is B, the information of A plus B should be the same as the set of paths on A and the set of paths on B. But in fact, there's a new path here, which isn't in either of the two. Okay, so this is just a really intuitive thing, right? Okay, so Adam's thesis describes exactly this using this notion of a veil. And I drew these two to indicate that there's, at minimum, a certain kind of ordering relationship between, on the one hand, systems and on the other, phenoms. So if, again, looking at this example, the phenoms would be the points, these green points. And so what we're trying to get at is like, in a naive sense, it's phenoms are like things you can observe, and systems are the things that generate what you can observe. Okay, and this is what we have discussed earlier as being like, okay, there is a certain maybe ideological or philosophically problematic aspect to this, like, is this like a correlationist thing where we can only perceive certain things and then there's actually more behind the veil? But yeah, we should be able to subtract that out of this formalism because it's not necessary, right? But intuitively, it's still useful to think of like there's systems that have some behavior. We only know some subset of that behavior, which are in the phenoms. So a great example would be
he could have called the systems the noumenons, but he didn't have the guts.
Yeah, exactly. If you really want to go
the noumenes,
yeah, they should just be the noumenes, yeah, because they're inaccessible in some way. We can only access the phenoms, and the veil is just how we map the two, right? And later on, he's going to show that there's actually a inverse mapping. So there's also a map from phenoms back to systems. But yeah, we'll have to get there. So I wrote down a quick example of this. So political economy example. We have M being the capitalist world, S being markets, and R are other subsystems. So everything besides markets. And then we have this thing, which is just like the empty system, right? Just to make this mathematically work out, we have a system at the bottom. And these arrows indicate inclusion. So we're saying with this square here or this diamond shape, that S belongs inside of M, R belongs inside of M, and the empty system belongs to both S and R.
Which is another way of saying that systems are, let's say, absolutely distinct from the rest, right? Their union is just empty set.
Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah, because what they have in common is nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a way of perhaps making it more clear without not from the mathematical side, but just generally why it would be useful to have it there, right?
Yeah, great example. Yeah, because we want this empty subsystem is just there to indicate cases where there is an absolute difference between two systems. Yeah. Of course, we could argue about whether markets and other subsystems really have that clear of a distinction. But yeah, for now, let's say S and R can be totally separated. And then let's define a change in M, so a change to the world by M intersect with C, right? We'll say that this is the intersection operator, right? This middle thing. And also let's define two functions called the projections, which take the capitalist world and it projects it onto a subsystem. And we can think of that as saying, like, when something happens in the capitalist world, the projection is how the market, pi of 1, for example, would be how the market reacts to that change or something, whatever happens, right? The market registers that change. Whereas on the right-hand side, pi of 2, it's how other subsystems would recognize that change, right? There's just viewpoints, two different standpoints on.
So for example, there's a change in, I don't know, a crisis, and then you can have, for example, in the market, a problem of overproduction that appears as a quantity in the market, right? Of low turnover of commodities. But also you can have like social problems with unemployment happening in something which is not the market, but like a social condition.
Exactly, yeah. Like, yeah, think of something like an earthquake. The market will react in one way. Like, let's say the earthquake destroys some supply lines and maybe the price of oil goes up. That's how this pi 1 would act. Whereas, we also have other subsystems in terms of like the national, political, social life of people affected by the earthquake. That would be the pi of 2. Okay, so given that definition, we can define outcomes in S and R as these sets. So S contains two outcomes, SP and SQ, and R contains two outcomes, R of P and R of Q. And let's let this symbol mean feasibility. So feasibility means if X is true, then it's feasible that Y is feasible, right? So to give it more interpretation, let's say S, the market, a feasibility relation would be something like, if the price of oil goes this high, then it's possible that interest rates will, fall or something like that, right? And then in R, something that's a non-market feasibility. So if this person is elected as president, then this other thing may be possible, right? Mm-hmm. That's what a feasibility would be. So let's say that in the current capitalist world, we have two feasibility relations. S of P, if S of P is there, then R of P is feasible. If S of Q is there or true, R of Q is feasible, right? And then similarly, we have C, which is a change of some kind. And here, it's almost the same, except notice that the RQ is it's R of P on the left, but R of Q here, right? So it's S of P, both S of P and S of Q have the same feasibility of R of Q. So notice that if we follow the pi of 1, the projections, we are effectively taking only the left-hand side of the feasibility. We're only taking this bottom part, sorry. So S of P and S of Q would be the projection onto the market of this relation. And whereas on the right, you know, actually, yeah, S of P and S of Q would also be the projection.
Yeah.
Right. Because we only care about the
market conditions. Right?
The market conditions, exactly. Now, this formula is an interactional effect. So the projection on the market of M intersected with C is S of Q only, right? That means we're taking the intersection of M and C first, and that means taking what's in common with both of them. Well, the only thing that's in common with both of them is this one, right? The two right-hand terms. That's the only thing in common. And then if we project that, the pi of 1 means we only care about this part here, right? So that's why this is S of Q, or yeah, S of Q here. And then here we have the separate terms considered. So we've already determined what that is. Here, pi 1 of M is this one, and pi 1 of C is this one. And if we intersect those two, we get, because they're exactly the same, we get two terms here, SP and SQ. So notice that there's some kind of inequality happening. Okay, so how would we interpret this? Well, it's like saying that the market will have two different reactions to something which to a change which might not register the same way in both of them. So
and the way that I understand this is to say that the projection on the market of the change is not the same as the projection of the market plus the projection of the change, right? Which is already a weird, I mean, it's a good definition of the thing where what you actually see is something that's smaller than the sum of the parts, right?
Yeah.
Like you generate some constraint that you can't really tell where it came from.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if you think about it, the right-hand side is kind of like, almost like a prediction, you would say, in the market, because let's say we're at M right now, the current capitalist world, and the market has a certain perspective on M. Then the market says, okay, what's going to happen if someone gets elected president? Well, the intuitive way of calculating that is just to say, well, how does the market register that person being elected? And maybe you can run some study or maybe ask like investors or something like that, right? And you would have a certain answer. And then you say, okay, well, whatever the current conditions are, we just need to add this information about this new event, and we will get our answer. We'll know how the market will react to this change. However, when that change actually happens, that's this term here. When that change actually happens, you might get something unexpected. You might get and here it's more constrained, right? The change that happens, you actually get less information here than you did here. But that's because this is a system of feasibility. So maybe something becomes less feasible, whereas it was more feasible before.
So it's like a weird kind of perspective error where you, in this case, you assume that change is like an addition to conditions, whereas in effect, what you get is the union of conditions, right? So it's the lowest common point between the change and the world.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's what this operator is. Kind of the common, yeah, the common point of the change in the world. Yeah. Yeah. I think actually this example, I kind of copied it from Adams in section 2.4. I think this changes. This example is not the best, especially because like we're using market and capitalist world in a very loose way. I think we could revisit this part, and because I think exactly this is what Marx kind of was going for in a way, because he wanted a way to kind of separate out, you could say maybe separate out other subsystems and markets, and kind of show this emergent phenomenon in the form of the worker, right? Because the worker kind of straddles both, right? The worker is not simply a market phenomenon. The worker has another subsystem that they belong to. This is why in that section of the section 2.4 of the paper, Adams calls it a contagion effect, which is a kind of interactional effect. So contagion in the sense of like a disease, right? Of infecting things, yeah, in an epidemiological sense. So as I said here, that if C, the change, was confined to the market or to some other subsystem, then this equality would hold, right? And we can kind of see this from the example that the reason that C caused this inequality is because we have something that impacts both SP and S and R, right? But if we had something like, for example, RP and RQ, instead of this one, right? If we had RP, RQ, then this interactional effect would not happen. So it's the interaction between the subsystem S and the subsystem R that that made that inequality occur. Okay, I think this disease example is actually better from chapter 3. So here we have two systems, S1 and S2, and the numbers basically mean how many neighbors have to be infected before I am infected. So A, in order to have to be infected, must have two neighbors, right? And B must have one neighbor. Well, since neither of that is satisfied, they're both healthy, right? In S2, A needs 0 neighbors to be infected, which means A itself is infected, whereas B needs 2 neighbors to be infected for it to become infected, right? So we can think about the infection as being a sequence of these graphs glued together. So S2 at time 1, let's say, you have 1 person infected. At time 2, you attach another person, another entity or whatever to this graph, but it's okay because they need 2 neighbors to be infected for themselves to be infected. But the problem happens when you take the conjunction of S1 and S2, right? By taking the conjunction, what I mean is you take the lower of the 2 elements. So A, because 0 is less than 2, this becomes 0. And because 1 is less than 2 here, this becomes 1. Right? Now you get a situation where both become infected.
Yeah, I think that what I feel like it's the crucial part in this part that is, again, goes back to that counterintuitive basis, is that he constantly goes back to this point that you need two conditions, or he calls two ingredients for generative effects, right? The first ingredient is that you need more than one system, and he even gives an idea of I'm trying to remember where this is. I think it's just before that example you just gave, right? So the first idea is that you need interconnection, right? And then you need interaction. So interconnection means you need two systems. And the first thing he does, which I think is, I'm not sure if it's obvious, but is the idea that interconnection means the meet operator, right? It's a union like this, like you wrote of S1 with S2, right?
Yeah. And there could be different kinds of operators, like in this toy example, it's just saying take the lesser of the two, right? Yeah. So if you compare the two A's, take the lesser of them.
Yeah. So, but that idea that interconnection means binding things together by equating by let's say maintaining the minimal value, the lower value.
Yes.
Right. So between 2 and 0 in A, you'll keep 0. Between 1 and 2 in B, you'll keep 1, right?
Yeah.
That, I think the first trick, the first magic trick that he does is to show that, well, if I showed you S1, it's outside of the space of possibilities that A is getting infected and therefore B is getting infected. That's not a possible outcome, because there are only two nodes and A requires two neighbors to be infected. It's impossible. So it's out of the picture, right? And in S2 also, it's impossible. The statement, the two nodes are infected, is also impossible, because even though one is infected, the other needs two neighbors, and there are no two neighbors, so it's also impossible, right? So it's weird, the idea that the conjunction of two spaces where the statement both are infected is impossible, that in their conjunction, it is possible.
Exactly.
So that's the first thing that makes it look weird. Like, okay, how is it possible that the interconnection between things which have some limited degrees or some limited states, that their conjunction has a higher, makes certain things possible, makes states possible that are not possible in each of them, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and we see that with this coronavirus stuff, because you could say that like two countries that have the virus under control, if you were to open travel between them, you might say, oh, well, then that means they'll be fine because both of them individually have the virus under control. But let's say you open up, travel, suddenly the virus breaks out, right? So that would be an example where there was something there in the interaction itself that was not accounted for. Yeah, and so I was trying to take that idea of the disease example, which I think I should have shown first, and I wanted to bring that to the political economy example, because I think that's a nice way of maybe approaching notions of crisis in capitalism, right? Because individual capitals don't have a problem, right? They follow the law of competition and so on, and then they extract profit, and there's actually a increase in technology and productive processes for each individual capital, and in that sense, it is kind of making some progress. It's making some advancement of some kind. But if you combine all these, capitals together, right? You take the totality of them, you get something arises from that interaction that cannot be traced back to the individual capitals alone, right? So this idea, Marx's notion of totality, is exactly this, right? It's to be found in the interaction, not in the parts. So yeah, I think this disease example shows that. A more pure mathematical example or topological example is this thing from Penrose, right? The Penrose Triangle, where you have these three parts here, which on their own are perfectly, feasible parts. You can build them.
Yeah, they all live in Euclidean space.
Yeah, they live in our space. We can manipulate them and everything. But if you were to glue them in a certain way, you produce this shape that can't possibly exist in our space. Okay, so here's a nice point to try to think about the original thing I was trying to say about obstacle. Okay, in what sense is there an obstacle which, this inequality symbolizes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think another way of saying that, I mean, because the obstacle thing, I mean, in the previous example of the contagion, it's very unclear what we mean by loss of exactness, right?
Yeah.
But here, I think it's easier because if you look at the image, I mean, it goes back to what you said in the first example, because in the first example, you had like two red dots like this, right? And you actually glued them together, like you made their distinction 0.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they count as the same. And if they count as the same, this tree and this graph, they are connected, right? Then there's a path. Due to this coarse view, right? Like this less detailed, less distinct view. So that was actually a loss of information, right? This A and B were different and you treated them as if they were the same. You glued them, right? And here is similar because if you respect these lines and these lines and so on, like the edges and the surface and the edges, they can only glue in an open, like you cannot glue everything. You cannot glue, let's say if you call this A, B, C, D, E, and F, you can only glue some of them. You cannot glue all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But in order to create this figure, you need, for example, at this point here, to have accepted a kind of a weird gluing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, in this case, I think actually I don't think you need 3, you only need 2, right? I don't think this is only the connection of 2 things, not 3. I don't think you need this. Right? If you glue this,
yeah,
2 things.
I think this is one, this is another one, this is another one, right? Yeah, I mean the drawing itself is not to scale, so it's kind of hard to see.
It's because you have here 1, you have here 2, and the third is the thing you're going to construct. So this comes from, for example, this is so let me just clear my own drawing. If let's say this is C and D, and this is A and B, so this would be C, this would be B, this is D being equated with A in a weird way, and here's some weird conjunction between C and B.
Yeah, I mean from the example that I saw,
it's actually the gluing of 3 things.
Yeah, it's the gluing of 3, but I mean, yeah, I'm not sure about the technical aspect here. It's possible maybe you could do it in 2. I think it's just
actually,
that.
Now that you say, I think you're right, because this is from one, this is from the other, and this is from the other, right? You have 3.
Yeah.
Anyway, but but in any way, like there is something here that you had to identify in this tree, right? There is like a point of identity between the 3 that you need to make them less distinct to make this gluing possible, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there was a loss of some kind. Yeah. Yeah, and really the heart of his paper is about this phenomenon, but now transposing it onto systems and phenoms, and then the idea that these are something like behaviors, right? So this would be like a behavior of some system. This would be so behavior of individual system. Right, and then this is the behavior of the whole system. Total system. Right, so yeah, you have 3 different behaviors, you put them together and you get some behavior that doesn't really make sense from the original. And that obstacle is basically this unknown space, this unknown gluing, which can be characterized in a specific sense, in a mathematical sense. We can actually calculate this obstacle or something about this obstacle. We can extract information from it. And actually, in the last meeting, we were talking about film, right? I think Hakel brought up the Eisenstein example of like superimposing shots in a film. And I think that also applies here, right? If you take one shot of a film and another shot of a film and you consider them separately, that's much different from when you superimpose those shots, or you somehow glue those shots together in a sequence. There's ways of doing that which you would derive something that you couldn't find in the individual shots alone. So I think film is also a great
yeah, I think the Kuleshov example is perfect. You know the Kuleshov experiment.
Oh, which one is that?
Man, it's actually worth. It's definitely on YouTube.
The one with the faces, right? And the
yeah, I think you like this, Dennis, because it's actually. I mean, it's like 15-second long, but let's open it here. Basically, Kuleshov was one of these experimental Soviet filmmakers, and he was very much interested in what is the, let's say, the technique of montage. What is it doing? And
I can share.
Yeah, my screen is.
Yeah, you can share it.
Do you have it, Raquel?
No, I was going to say another thing, because I was just preparing something about Eisenstein here, and I have those shots from the lion that is asleep, and he's waking, then he's trying to grab something. If you want, I can show.
Yeah, we should talk about those too.
There's also a video on, I think it's Hitchcock talking about the Kuleshov effect.
Ah,
Also.
really?
Yeah.
I wish my internet was like helping, but apparently it's not. It might be because I have like 10,000 tabs open at the same time.
I think I found it. I could share it.
Sorry, if you could.
Let's see here.
Like a really short.
Over here.
It has the face of
Like this thing, right?
Yeah, just look at it. It's, you can see that's what this guy is weirdly like trying to. So it's like always the same reaction shot, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that depending on the shot is glued to, it's juxtaposed to. So the woman, the dead child, or the food, that you would get a different feel for what how the guy is feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's seeing the dead child, and you can, like, the idea is to see if the connection between the dead child and the reaction shot doesn't produce a slightly different effect on the reaction shot. Like the sum of the two is not the same all the time.
Yeah.
So juxtaposing the food and the guy makes it look like he has hungry eyes, or mourning eyes in the case of the dead child, or desirable eyes in the case of the woman, something like this, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. Yeah. Yeah. Basically it's like this, right? Except
Yeah.
I guess you would say it's just two parts. So shot one, right? Shot one, shot two, right?
Yeah, it's even nice in the idea that it's kind of trying to add, like, to suggest that two physical pictures bound together can kind of give you the idea of an extra dimension, like a feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the connection between two things would give you a space that is slightly different or slightly bigger, because it includes like a statement about this guy is sad or this guy is happy, and that statement is not really either in the shot or in the reaction shot. If you look at them separately, or if you combine them with other things, that statement wouldn't be valid in either world. It's only valid in the world where you get the conjunction of the two.
Yeah. And really, this is at the heart of all film, insofar as two shots, two still frames are always glued together to form any shot, right? So like two still things, one after the other, will produce the sense of motion or something like that, right? That's like...
yeah, it's already an effect that is not in either shot. Like there is no motion in any frame.
Right, there's no motion in frames, but like, yeah, motion is an emergent effect, or it's a interactional effect in this sense. Should we see the Eisenstein example?
Yeah, I really want to see the lion. Let me just make a call.
Can you?
I could stop
here.
Here, I was just doing this because the first line is asleep. The second one, sorry. Okay, sorry. The first one is asleep. The second one is waking, and the third one is like trying to catch something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even more amazing because they're statues. So absolutely excluded from the pictures that they would be moving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the thing is that you have the impression that a statue is moving. So it's more than, we know that the frames are static, but now Eisenstein is telling us that a statue is moving.
Yes,
not just a frame. You know?
Yeah,
that takes it even further. Yeah,
that takes it even further, because it's part of the world of each frame that they cannot move, right? So it's not simply that it's static because it's a photo. Like it's the photo of something impossible to move.
Yeah,
it's a bit like showing you the trick, like saying like I can even take away the illusion of movement, and that illusion still persists. Or like I can take away the conditions of the illusion, but the effect of movement is still there. Yeah.
And I think that's actually, I mean, with Kuleshov, he tries to dismantle the illusion by repeating. So you see the same shot, and then just by putting it next to a different shot, you get a different totality, right? Like, or you get an effect on this total space because the feeling changes, but you get the same image, like 3 times the same reaction shot, exactly the same shot. But it's more from repetition and not from having as the content of the image something which is impossible to move, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Adam's text, he gives the metaphor at the beginning about the magic trick, right? Where I'll share again, but the magic trick where if the magician shows you everything, you lose the effect. But also, if the magician shows you nothing, meaning the veil hides everything the magician is doing, then you also don't get the magical effect, right? The effect is actually a space in the sense that it must lie somewhere between the total thing and the minimal thing, right? If we were to consider the veil as having a switch or like a knob, right? This is my attempt to draw a knob, and I can turn it this way, right? I can either make this veil hide everything, so at maximum, that means this system is mapped to this phenom. I see nothing, and I'm right. Actually, it's not just this. It's like everything, right? Everything is mapped to nothing. Or I can do it the other way. I can twist it this way, and now nothing is mapped. Sorry, how's it like? I either see the entire trick. Oh yeah, that's right. So I see everything like this. So there's no loss of information. So on the one hand, this bottom green arrow means I lose out all the information, or I show you everything. In both cases, the magic, the interactional effect goes away.
This is something that is a bit, I mean, he has two big examples, like, or metaphors, right? The first one is the magic, which I find actually very beautiful, though it's one where he makes a subtle point that is sophisticated, which is the one you just made. Like usually we would just say, Arthur is seeing the magic. If Merlin shows him the full trick, every step, the magic is gone.
Yeah.
But then he says, yeah, but if he doesn't show anything, like, or if everything is hidden, there's also no magic. That's sophisticated because it shows that there are bounds to this show and hide. It's not like absolute, right? You can tweak it. You can show a bit more, a bit less. So there is a structure to it. I think that's the sophisticated point. The not so sophisticated point is that his first introducing example is about, let's say, systems interacting. So the magician is playing with things and a person looking. So it makes it seem like it's a mental problem. Like if the person is, I mean, it doesn't make clear that he's not discussing a thesis about perception. Because in the worst case scenario, you could take his theory to be about, you know, the world is fully determined, fully connected, fully determined like a domino kind of sequence. And we, because we have particular views of this, we think new stuff is being produced. But if we could see behind the veil, we would see that it's just purely determined, like a vulgar Spinozism, where if you arrive at a higher level of intelligence or knowledge, you go beyond the veil and you see reality for what it is, fully determined causal chain, right? So I think that's the worst interpretation of what he's doing, because what he does in other places, for example, the contagion example, other examples, is that the combination of systems and phenoms, they both form a world. So contagion effects or these generative effects, they are not mental effects. They're not, this lost information is not for me. It's intrinsic to the world.
Exactly.
Like in the same way that prices are not like in my head. They're not like, as I was saying last time, like we shouldn't really treat these things as being for the capitalist or his interpretation or an effect of his personal incapacity to see the whole, right? It's concrete the way that the compression of information is happening. This loss is part of what's going on. It's not our take on what's going on, right? So I think that that example of magic has a bit of this problem, even though it's very nice. And he could, if he just took it a bit further, it wouldn't be called magic. It would be called fetishism. You know, if he just like pushed it a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. That we could think about fetishism exactly that. Also a knob, and let's say this is max fetishism, and this is no fetishism, right? Or zero, right? And this idea that so zero would be something like we see nothing, right? There's no, let's say the space of value is completely occluded. We have no idea what's happening. Max would be we see everything. We have a complete. This would kind of be close to maybe Paul Cockshot's vision of being able to calculate labor values completely, right?
Yeah, we have an input that is the direct production, the direct quantities of production, and computers wouldn't have the bandwidth that we have, so they would be able to kind of chew on that raw data.
Exactly. So we could think of this as like the idea of if fetishism is objective versus subjective, then it would disappear. Just because it disappears at zero and at max. So it's not here and it's not here, but it exists somewhere in this in-between space. The question is whether, that it can be thought objectively, or is that something like a magic trick, right? Can it be thought of as a way of, as a objective space on its own?
Yeah, I think that the correct term that he should have chosen is not veil, but real abstraction. Like, abstraction is the proper name for losing some exactedness or some singularity and kind of putting different things in the same box, right? But in a way that happens in the world and not in a way that happens in your mental space. Like, it's not simply in your head that different bottles of water in a supermarket are treated as the same, right? They're absolutely distinct extensionally. They're in different times and spaces. They're made of different molecules. There's nothing in one bottle of water that is the same as the other. But in a capitalist society, you map both of them into the same price. That mapping of two bottles of water into one price is not happening in your head. That's a social practice that is abstracting from the use. For example, the fact that one bottle is the water is a bit darker. Like it's just a bit, like in Rio, this is happening. It's just not really clear water. And the other is a bit clearer. And that might actually affect your choice. Like, I'm gonna take this bottle. They have the same price, but they're different, But the price system is a phenomenological system which abstracts from that difference. That's not happening in your head. That's literally happening, that's orienting your social practice, right?
Yeah, but if, for example, like if we said, oh, well, it's information that's being hidden. So what if we were to suddenly print with every bottle of water, we were on the label, let's say there's a manual or something, there's a book that outlines the entire production process, the entire chain of events that happened for this bottle of water to be made. That still wouldn't get rid of the fetishism, right? That still would not remove this effect. I think that's the tricky part, because like price, you lose some information with price, but is it possible to recover that information if you were to like write it down, let's say?
Yeah, because I think that's where the thing gets not confusing, but it's important to make the distinction, right? Because if the phenoms are, let's say, objective, that means that they exist in the same, they're just simpler systems. They're not qualitatively distinct systems. which means that they are in the world and they can lead to effects on the systems themselves, right? So, for example, knowing that bottles of water are costing around $1, it will affect how new people produce bottles of water. It's not simply going to affect, my relation to the bottle of water. It's not in my head that I'm conventionally accepting the price, right? So the price is a sort of abstraction from the production process, and the fact that the production process is actually working on real bottles and real bottled water that is distinct. Each bottle is different, but that abstraction is actually putting back its form into the production process. And in the production itself, we're treating bottles based on the sort of phenom that they're going to be, right? People are going to treat them as indistinct, so we should produce them indistinctively as well. So it's not a theory of how we as subjects abstract from reality and only see the value of stuff rather than what they really are. But both parts of that equation, right, the actual production and the abstraction from use, they're both in the world. For example, if you wanna tell, like, why are these bottles kind of together in the shelf? You will only understand if you take the veil in consideration. They are together in the shelf because that's the shelf of cheap bottles, together with some very cheap juice as well, rather than in the shelf with wine and some other stuff. Right? So you don't need to assume that phenoms are mental and systems are real. You can keep both in the world. I think anything that, any process that deals with abstraction or that deals with mapping many to one, right? In the sense of they're monotonic, as we were talking about, like they still keep some order, but they reduce the difference, which is just a definition of abstraction, right? You want to keep some properties, but forget about others. Like 10 people that cheer for the same soccer team, they are 10 different people, but I can still map them all to like generic supporters of Flamengo. Like you kept an information, they're all cheering for the same team, but you lost some distinction. Like you don't care, one is called Joe, the other is called Peter, or whatever. So I think veiling has a bit of a connotation of inferiority or error, in the sense of this obstruction is for a viewer, whereas abstraction loses that, right? And any process that treats things abstractly can be said to be a veil. Perhaps not all processes that deal with abstractions, but that's sort of practical abstraction, right? Because magic is kind of like that. You need to position the audience from a certain perspective, right? Or if, for example, if you want to do the Penrose Triangle in reality, and there are many examples of people who do it, right? They take little pieces of wood, and they know that if the other stays in an exact position, you will see the Penrose Triangle. If they move position, they no longer see it. It's no longer there. Mm-hmm. So that's a practical abstraction. Like it's not a function of the person, it's a function of the perspective. If anyone goes into that perspective, you will see the triangle. If you move out of the perspective, you don't see it anymore. So it's not about your head. Sure, it requires some specific optical conditions to be perceived, but they're not specific to the Penrose Triangle, right? You don't need to have like a mental problem. The actual quality, let's say the actual abstracting is going on by combining positions of the pieces of wood with the place from which you're seeing. That's the apparatus of abstraction, not the viewer, right?
Yeah, because I mean, you could just as well take a picture from that spot and you would see it.
Which is how you get these things online.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, our magic trick that we care about is the one here, right? The veil is happening somewhere here, right? Right, or at least that's the classical example, right?
That's a nice,
Veil.
yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Right. So then the question is, from what standpoint do we see this?
You know,
The magic happening, right?
Dennis, when you were talking about how we could see fetishes in space, and I think now when you're talking about the circuit of capitals, I was thinking about some image that if I can share here, would you mind if I?
Yeah, I'll stop there.
There is an image in this chapter 3 of book 1 of Capital that Marx says here in the first paragraph. He says that the way he deals with the contradiction, for example, the contradiction that is inside the concept of commodity, is to find a way, find a form where this contradiction can goes on.
Right.
And he talks about the ellipse. I don't know if I can find it here. Just a second. I had it here in just a sec.
You mean that passage when he says about the general form of the resolution of contradiction?
Yeah.
I think if you search the word method, it will appear. I think he uses the word method there.
Method. I don't know, because I think it was. Sorry, I think I lost it.
Yeah, I was thinking while we're looking for this, isn't contradiction a good name for this obstacle also, like this thing of the veil and losing information? I wonder if there's some connection there we could draw. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that there might be like a way to yeah, but I remember the quote that you're talking about.
No, but it's here. The first paragraph. I was. It's here in my face.
oh, this first one, okay.
Yeah, we saw in a former chapter that the exchange of commodities implies contradictory and mutually exclusive conditions. The differentiation of commodities into commodities and money does not sweep away these inconsistencies, but develops a modus vivendi, a form in which they can exist side by side. This is generally the way in which real contradictions are reconciled. For instance, it is a contradiction to depict one body as constantly falling towards another, and at the same time constantly flying away from it. The ellipse is a form of motion which, while allowing this contradiction to go on, at the same time reconciles it. So I was just thinking that ellipse is a form in space that can help us think fetishism, I think.
Yeah, because in an ellipse, you have this, well, yeah, in motion in general, right? It's like motion being kind of a paradox from whether you're moving away or from something depends on, at least you have to take some slices of that motion, right? But with the ellipse, you can take certain slices of the motion and it looks like you're falling towards an object, right? I think that's what this is saying, right?
Yeah. And it's also, you have to also hit for that you cannot solve it, but you can find a way that they can goes on. It can goes on.
Yes, yeah.
Without resolving, without solving. I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be like,
yeah,
if we could take this notion of interaction and come up with a dialectical, like the mathematics to go along with the dialectics, the dialectical process, right? Of some inconsistency in the inequality of behaviors when two systems are put together. That creates the inequality. But then this inequality itself, when that takes a form, when that takes has an existence of its own, that's when you get this effect, I think. Right.
Yeah, I think the first two statements are very, very clear, right? In chapter 1 and 2, Marx showed that use and exchange value of a commodity are actually, let's say, two systems: the system of concrete labor and the system of abstract labor, the system of quality and the system of quantity, and there is incompatibility between the two. Like the things you say of one are totally different from the things you say of the other, right? They're mutually exclusive conditions. But then that distinction between use and exchange is kind of both preserved and transformed in the way that you distinguish between commodities and money. Commodities that are exchanges moving towards use, you buy them to consume, and a commodity that now functions as just a means of exchange between others. Its use is exchange, right? So something which was like incompatible becomes two sides, becomes more intrinsically connected. And that contradiction is expressed in the form rather than be hidden below, right? So the differentiation of commodities into commodity and money doesn't sweep away the difference between use and exchange, but develops a form which they can exist side by side, right?
And I think the same happens in the circuit of capital, because the contradictions that are inside the process of production appears in competition, for example. It's the same structure, I think, the same method. You have a contradiction, you find a form like an ellipse to develop this contradiction.
Yeah, I think it's nice to think about orbits as generative effects, because you have two systems, one, let's say a smaller planet and a larger planet, or something like this, and then the addition of one to the other should suggest that one either falls, like the smaller falls into the larger, right? But the system made of those two systems, their actual interaction is an orbit. It's not just a falling. So that orbit is kind of generative. It's not contained in the you cannot find the orbit by looking simply at the two systems separately and imagining their impossible conjunction, which would be like a collision. But what you actually get is this sort of path, right? It's an orbit.
Yeah. I think the question is whether the notion of impossibility here is like maybe too strong, because it's like it's more like different scales, and depending on like from the scale of one system, when you're just looking at one system and looking at another system, it seems impossible, but then their conjunction clearly shows that it's not, right? So I wonder if the question is whether this contradiction or this impossibility disappears. So Hakel was saying it continues, the contradiction continues, or it persists in the ellipse. But from a certain perspective, I mean, it's just also not, it's no longer a contradiction. It's just, you would just need another formalism to describe that. You need the theory of gravitation to describe that motion now, right? So it's like, yeah, but yeah, that goes into whether dialectics is like a relative thing or maybe something that happens.
But I think that's a good idea, because I mean,
sense.
the definition that that Adam gives of interaction is that V operator, right? Which is basically the merging of rules, right? So it's looking for the sort of space where the rules of two systems have been mapped onto each other, and you take the least value of both, right? And that space is distinct from the space of the rules of each of them. Like it's not contained in each of them. That seems, I mean, there are some nice, Hegelians love to find Hegel everywhere. So there is a nice idea that you need to start from the plurality and not from the unity. So there's only generative effects if there are multiple systems. There can be no generative effect if you only have one system. So you need two, right? So unity always comes later. So it's more of a it's dialectical in that sense, and also that the unity of the two is something which is neither one nor the other, right?
Yeah, a really good point. I mean, I think we have to develop this more. So yeah, I mean, just so we can get through, I have a lot of the formalism to go through. So I was hoping that this maybe would help us understand the rest of the text, because he uses a lot of math. So I wanted to give just an introduction to it, because a lot of it doesn't require, it's not that sophisticated. We just need to know some basic terms. So his formalism, he defines this thing called a sandbox, which is just a collection of two things, right? One is S, a set of something, and ordering. And this ordering is binary, so and transitive. So it tells you what given two things, are they related or not, right? And if transitive means obviously if this is true and this is true, then this is true, right? So and then this would be a pre-order relation. So
man, does anyone else use the term sandbox?
Yeah, I've never heard that term. Yeah, it's a bit like this is the easy stuff, I guess, and there's something much bigger out there that I'm not showing you. I don't know. Yeah, sandbox is kind of demeaning in that sense. But yeah, so you have this object called the sandbox, and you have this interaction operation between two sandboxes, let's say. So it takes two elements of your sandbox, and it produces a new element, right? So let's say if S contains A, B, C, right? Then this V operator says A, V, B produces C, let's say. right? So this implicitly means that there's a closure of this operation. So no matter what two elements you pick from S, you can always find a third element where this holds, right? And that's called interaction. So we can have many different interpretations. We could say, oh, C is the system, you know, just like Gabriel, you were saying, you have system 1 here, system 2, and system 3 is like the common rules of system 1 and 2. Or you can say that it's kind of the adding of the rules. It can be additive or subtractive in a way, right?
Yeah, it can give you just as like the operation between S1 and S2 can give you S1, right? It can
also just give you S1. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very loose in that sense. So any type of interaction, as long as it's closed, meaning you always get another element of S, is okay. So those are two ingredients. And then you get the idea of a quasi-veil, which is not quite a veil yet. And the quasi-veil takes our system, our set of systems, or our sandbox, sorry, and it maps it to phenoms. So P is also a sandbox, but it's called the phenoms, right? Sandbox. And this veil behaves in such a way that if there's an order relation in S between A and B, two elements of S, A and B, then that relation must hold after you've mapped the veil using the veil, right? So if A and B are in S like this, let's use a different color. This is S, and it contains an A and a B like this, and this is P, then I'm allowed to map, right, let's say X and Y like this. I'm allowed to do this. I'm also allowed to do this, right? I can also take both of them to the same element here. This is also allowed because as long as in P I say that X is less than or equal to itself, right? If this is true, then I can collapse this A and B to X. What I'm not allowed to do is I cannot do the following. I cannot take B down here and A up here. This is not allowed. Okay, so that's the veil. It just prevents this from happening, but everything else is allowed pretty much.
So it's preserving basic ordering.
Basic ordering, yeah.
That's what a monotone mapping is, right?
Yes, it's monotone, yeah. Exactly, yeah. Okay, so this is already, a very basic idea of a veil. And then the interactional effect occurs when the mapping of the interaction is not equal to the interaction of the mapping, let's say.
I think that's the basic statement of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
The mapping of the interaction is not equal to the interaction of the mapping.
Yes. Yeah. Here you have two different mappings, right? Two times that the veil has happened, and then you interact them. You make them interact. This time you've interacted first. You've interacted inside of your sandbox. Then you mapped. And this fails to be the same. And what we're calling contradiction or obstacle it lies in this inequality, right?
I mean, I think this can find a nice distinction with Marx, because let's say the valuing of money, of means of production in conjunction with labor. So the buying of means of production and labor is different from the buying of means of production, separate from the buying of labor, right? If you buy just B, so let's say right? So A is like means of production, and this is labor, right? And this is kind of capital, right? If you just buy constant capital or buy labor, but they're different, right? They're separate, they're kept separate. No surplus can be produced. It can only be produced if you if you buy the two together.
Yeah, it's almost like the factory is,
like
here,
the factory,
right?
I mean, this is a good way of thinking about surplus value. Like how can there be the generation of value out of the interaction between labor and means of production? The value of labor plus the value of means of production still is not, this doesn't produce surplus. So if you take the value of constant capital plus the value of variable capital, this just gives you an equality, right? Of what you invested. But the combined, the value of the combination of the two, this can actually produce surplus here, right? So there can be something here that is not here.
Yeah, and the capitalist will say, well, this missing piece is actually the risk that I took to bring them together. Also, maybe the ingenuity of creating a production process, right? So there's some way of explaining away the difference as being an added value, right? If this is not true, then the capitalist will say, well, I can add a third thing, which is my contribution, right?
Yeah.
Say the capitalist contribution. Suddenly, this becomes equal to this, right? If let's say it was mapped to a price.
Yeah, that's literally the price of production. To add the profit rate as this third thing.
Yeah.
Then there is nothing generated. It's just returned, right?
Yeah. And this is always done after the fact, right? So it's just like something you do to make the contradiction go away.
Yeah, because this is cost of production plus average profit rate. This would be equal to the mass produced, the value of what's produced, like in a certain
total
sense, right?
Total capital or the total revenue or whatever.
I think that this little equation is I mean, he returns to it times and times again to show how relevant it is, right? This idea that the mapping of the conjunction is not the same as the conjunction between the two separate mappings, right?
Yeah, throughout the text, he uses this symbol, this symbol, this symbol, right? And different combinations of these things, right? But they're all different forms of interaction. It doesn't really matter what symbol he uses, but the idea is that the consistency is broken, right? Between the left side and the right side.
Yeah. And I mean, it does give credence that, Marx would at least reference, you can argue if it's like as a logic or as a metaphor, but he uses the essence and appearance part of the science of logic all the time, because this is pretty much, we could distinguish perhaps the two sides in this way, right? The systems as the essence and the phenomena as the appearance.
Okay, so the next few slides, so I wanted to characterize how Adams actually allows us to calculate the missing space, right? So I said here that the capitalist would say, hey, I added my portion of value here, right? This is my contribution. This is what makes this not a paradox or whatever, not a contradiction, because I added something here. So this actually, we shouldn't just throw this away or say that this is an ideological thing. This third term, this additional term, is actually what Adam tries to calculate. He says that, okay, if interactional effects are produced by this inequality, then we should be able to recover them by finding the space such that if I were to add that to this one, I could restore the equality again. So it's kind of the inverse movement, right? We lost information, but the way in which we lose that information can tell us about what was lost, right? And maybe we can think of it as experiments that we can conduct on the phenoms, right? We can conduct certain experiments such that we can prove that the space was added, the space that we need to add has certain properties. So we're trying to investigate this third thing here. And this is why there's this linear algebra stuff, because in the end, linear algebra is an actual tool we can use to find concrete, find out concrete things about this space, right? When you pair this with algebraic topology and other fields of math. So just a quick review. And also, I didn't have time to do this, but I know that, the calculating things with matrices and so on is actually really important for like analytic Marxists or Marxists who use
that
tools,
Krause
right?
guy we were looking into a lot of
Exactly, Krause, and I think there's this notation by Leon Tiff or whatever. I think Krause uses this, right? I didn't have time to look into this, but I mean, just think about this system of equations here. The x, y, and z can just be like the how much labor it is required to produce commodity X, how much labor is required to produce commodity Y and Z, and so on, right? So there is some connection between this stuff and the political economy. So here we have a system of equations, and we have set them to 0. So if you remember from math, there's a way that we can figure out the values of X, Y, and Z as long as the number of equations that we have is equivalent to the number of variables, of free variables we have, right? So because there's 3 equations here and there's 3 variables, we can do some stuff to figure out the solution. And this can be written very neatly in this format, where the coefficients of the equations can be written in rows or columns of vectors, and then the unknowns, what you're trying to discover, right, X, Y, and Z, can be written this way, and then the 0 comes from the equations themselves. And when we have something of this form, we call it a linear homogeneous system, right? It's homogeneous because it's equal to 0. Right, there are non-homogeneous systems where this can be like equal to 5 or something. But in the case of homogeneous systems, you have something really easy to calculate, right? Non-homogeneous systems are a little more difficult. Sometimes they don't have a solution. So so that's what this point is about. A homogeneous system will always have either a single trivial solution or it will have multiple solutions. So there's never a case where it won't have a solution at all, assuming that the number of unknowns is equal to the number of equations here. And solutions are vectors belonging to a vector space. So when we say we're solving this, we mean we're finding real values of X, Y, and Z such that this holds, right? Such that these equations will hold. So when in the case of a trivial solution, we only have the 0 vector. So this is easily seen if we plug in 0 for X, Y, and Z. It's in a trivial sense that this is always going to be true, right? 3 times 0 plus 2 times 0 plus 0 is 0. So in all the cases, this is always true. But in other cases, we might have an entire set of vectors, you know, possibly infinite vectors that satisfy the solution space, right?
Mhm.
So this is like, this pink line is the solution space. It's the space of all solutions to this, not necessarily this one, but to some particular matrix, right?
Mhm.
So this is the intuitive idea, that we can actually characterize our solutions as a space. So then we have to think, okay, every matrix actually can be is a representative of, represents a linear transformation. So what is a linear transformation? It is a transformation where this condition holds. So this looks very familiar to,
It's just the inverse of that inequality. It's like,
yeah, it's equal, right? So if,
yeah.
you know, there's a lot of axioms involved before we get to this point usually, but we can just say like vectors are these things, right? Vectors are, you can think of them as just a list of numbers, right? This is a vector, and you can add vectors together and so on, right? So linearity means if I add two vectors and I map them, it's the same as mapping each vector and adding afterwards, right? So that's what makes it a linear transformation. And then a matrix can represent a linear transformation given a choice of basis. So you need to choose some stuff because there can actually be maybe infinite numbers of representations of a linear transformation, depending on what's your, like, basically like what's your X, Y, and Z, right? If I choose this as my X, Y, and Z in a space, that gives me a certain type of matrix for transformations. But if I were to choose this one, for example, some other type, some other set of basis vectors, I would get another representation. So this is just because you have a matrix doesn't necessarily uniquely identify the linear transformation. You have to make a choice here. Okay, so the important part for Adam's text is this definition. The kernel of a matrix is the set of vectors that it takes to the zero vector. So here we should think of mapping as taking space, mapping one space to another space, right? We have a space which is implied by the matrix, and we have another space which is the target space. And the kernel is a set of vectors. So the kernel, we can think of it as like some set of things inside of here that are taken to zero in the target. Okay, and here already we have this idea very clearly because we've said that the set of solutions here defines a space. And what does it mean to be a set of solutions? Well, it means that we make this equation equal zero. So in other words, this thing here, this is a linear transformation, and it takes vectors. What we care about are the vectors that this transformation takes to zero. Mm-hmm. That's another way of reading this thing, right? This is why here, this last point says, finding all solutions to a linear homogeneous system is finding a kernel. They're the same thing, right? And this is what this shows us. So imagine you have some vector space, which is this green circle here, and you have a target vector space, which is this red circle. The kernel is a subset of our original space that gets mapped to zero in the target space. The image is simply the all the vectors and what they become in the target space. So clearly the kernel will be part of the image, right? In a trivial sense, because the kernel, when it's mapped by our linear transformation, we're taking this thing on the left and we're finding its image in the thing on the right. We're kind of projecting it or embedding it in the thing on the right. And we know from earlier that there's always at least one solution, right? Which is this, there's always one solution. So at the worst case scenario, this is just a single point, right? But there can be more than just this point. The kernel can be, it could be actually the whole space, right? So if, for example, my matrix was just 0, 0, 0, 0, the kernel of this is the entire space. If I have a two-dimensional space here, no matter what happens, no matter what vectors I have defined on this space, this will give me the 0 vector. So in that case, this kernel is everything. Mm-hmm. This white circle coincides with the green circle. And then there are cases where there's only one solution, so they coincide with a single point. So that's what this, so the kernel of F is a subspace of V. And then we can use this kind of categorical language, but it's also just an algebraic language to show that the kernel of F, which is our linear transformation, when you map it to V by this map P, that's the same as just identifying it inside of the green circle. So imagine this circle, and then this is the space here. The map P is just a map that maps point to point, this, right? And then the map F will take this to the 0 point here. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then the composition of the maps. So composition meaning I will take this map and then I'll take this map together, and I'll treat that as one map, one linear transformation. That is always equal to the 0 transformation. So this transformation that I said, in which it takes everything to the 0 vector, 0, 0, 0, 0. That's this, right? Maybe I should draw that over here. Obviously, this is for a two-dimensional case because there's 2 rows. So it's a 2 by 2, so it's for two-dimensional spaces. But if depending on whatever your space you're working in, this can be infinite numbers of rows and columns. So what this says is if I combine if I were to combine the kernel with some vector, I would get the 0 map. Okay. That's just a fancy way of saying the same thing, which is that the kernel goes to 0 here. Okay. Now, Adam uses this fact to characterize one particular interactional effect, which is that the kernel of A concatenated with B is not the same as the kernel of A concatenated with the kernel of B. And concatenation here is just simply putting the numbers together. So if A is a matrix, a linear transformation of this kind, and B is this kind, we can combine them in this way. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is over here, and 1, 0, 0, 1 is over here. And the kernel, meaning the set of solution vectors to each one, is not the same after you've concatenated. Before and after, let's say. So this inequality.
But that means basically that solving for A and solving for B is not the same, and then concatenating the result is not the same as solving for the concatenation of both.
Exactly. exactly. Yes, because kernel, you can read kernel as just solving for A. Yeah. So kernel of A means solve for A, kernel for B, solve for B. Concatenate those solutions together. So just put them all into one list of solutions. That's not the same as combining those two spaces and then solving for that combined space. Okay. So this is, and this is where we have a connection with, let's say, algebraic topology, because there's this notion of inexact sequences, exact and inexact sequences, which can't go into today. I can kind of give a sketch of it. But when you have an inexact sequence, you can make it exact again. So inexact meaning you lost some information, right? Something happened when you concatenated so as to make this inequality happen, right? And just like I said before with the capitalist saying, oh, well, let's just add my contribution to make everything work. The same can be said for spaces, that you can add some space for a given transformation. We don't know what it is yet, such that this equality is restored, right? So the interaction goes away, let's say. So we can say interaction or interactional effect disappears. But it didn't actually disappear. The interactional effect actually is here. This is the effect.
So it's not the, okay. So this is not the same as saying this is not, let's say, reconstructing this information. I think this is connected with what we call derived functors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Reconstructing the exact sequence is not the same as undoing the veil, in the sense that you don't necessarily go back to the original thing. You actually, let's say, give body to the excessive, to the generated effect, right?
Yeah, you give body to the effect. Yeah.
So actually, you would have, like, say, 3 times here, right? The time of, or 3 moments where you have the S sandbox being mapped onto P. So just like this, right? And then you get this third thing, which from P you reconstruct this S plus the generative effect.
Mm-hmm.
As a coded object, not simply as an excess, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this does not imply that this is a return to S.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not that this space we added could be found in the left-hand side.
Yeah, it was not hidden there, right?
Yeah, it was never hidden there. It's although, yeah, in a certain interpretation of some of his examples, you could say that it's kind of a axiom of choice, maybe like choosing certain things on the left and combining them together in a new way.
Yeah, because this thing here seems to be actually hidden between this and this.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if they interact in a way that gives you P, and you can, let's say, it's a condition, or it's constrained by S, because it depends on the things being interacting in the systems, and it depends on the veil, that you might be able to reconstruct this as this object here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
I mean, just because it gives two very different interpretations, right? Your one thing is to say no surplus was really produced by the conjunction of means of production and labor. It's just the appearance that they were produced. And if we reconstruct the price, the actual prices, you will see that the profit rate was always there, and that where it came from. A different thing is to say something was produced, but you can code that mapping, that veiling or abstraction back into an object afterwards, right? You can kind of retroact that effect and represent it as a third quantity.
Exactly.
But that's not the same thing as saying that, I mean, I can simply, like this balancing out, so the generative effect is just a surface effect. It's actually, I mean, it's, you're turning the relation into an object, and it's not simply substituting the relation for a hidden object that was always there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, it's hard to assign a meaning to it at this stage, but yeah, I think that's right. Like,
it's just because, I mean, I think the big danger, or something that at least I didn't see from the first chapters, but from the later on, the other ones, it seems like it might be the case, is that it talks about loss of exactness and loss of information as a productive thing. To lose information might lead you to effects that were not contained in the total view of the two interaction systems. So it seems like it's a productive thing, but this retroactive process of linearizing the cascade effect, right, makes it seem like you, to reconstruct the exactedness, like as if the exactedness is ontological, right? And the generative effect was an illusion. If you knew the exact information, you wouldn't, no generative effect would have occurred. Which is kind of what it seems like in the magic example, right?
Yeah, I guess it's like losing the loss, right? The loss itself was lost because the first loss happens with the interactional effect, with the inequality, right, of the mapping and so on. But then you can lose that loss, but you can restore it in a way by adding this third term. But the third term was never found in the previous.
Yeah,
it's a new thing. Yeah, and then that's really, so actually this next slide maybe can give us more clarity on what this object is, this third object. So Adam says that it connects behavior of a system to the behavior of its subsystems. So he outlines 3 problems that this object would be useful for. So the first problem is the forward type. So if we want to update the phenoms of the conjunction of 2 systems from knowing the individual ones. So if we have some information about this one and this one, we want to calculate this one. Right? Or let's say if we know 1 and 2 here, we want to calculate 3. So we can do that because if we know this, obviously this green one, right? This C object. The inverse problem is, what do we want to add to S to create or maintain a certain effect? So in this case, we have an effect that we want. So we know C, 1, and we know, let's say we know this one here. We know this one, S2, the phenom of S2. Now we want to figure out, what do we add to S2 to make this effect happen, right? So we want to maintain or produce a certain effect, knowing what the effect is. And then the divide and conquer problem, which is I want to solve a very complicated problem that is occurring in the S1 and S2 space, the conjunction of those 2 spaces, but it's too complicated to figure out. So I'm going to just solve it for this one and this one, and then since I know this third space, the effect space, I can I can have an easier time solving that problem.
It's funny because this is at the very limit of that whole idea of, especially with the divide and conquer problem, because it's very in the limit of the idea that, you know, there is some degree of information in a system that is a function of its integration and not a function of its parts, so that if you divide the system back into its parts, you lose that added information. Mm-hmm. Right? Which I'm like in the integrated information thing, this partitioning is very relevant to define the actual complexity of the system. Polito uses this as well to talk about why connectedness is it's a very good measure for integrated complexity, right? You want to also, there is a way of probing into these things where you want to see how much information you lose when you divide a system into its parts. Right, that gives you a measure of how much of that information is a function of its connection, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was also mentioning that, I mean, the basic formula of generative effect is really surprisingly similar to what the definition of integrated information is, and which is exactly what you lose when you cut a system, basically. So when you consider
perfect. Yeah.
as their parts, and there's this guy called Pedro Mediano, in which he has this nice article called Beyond Integrated Information, in which there's this nice formula in where is it? Just a second.
Let me also make you a co-host here, so if you want to share.
How do I share my share screen? Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So he basically, so he has like a certain description of a system, which is like, it has like, say, x1 and x2. So the full system would be something like when you consider it as a full thing, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And wait, so I'm not sure if, yeah. And then he breaks down, he decomposes this using this theorem of partial information decomposition. You can basically do that for any system using information theory. And then you get one term, which is like the redundant information, which both x1 and x2 have and they share. And one term that's called unique information, which pertains only to x1. Another term for the other part, and then you get a synergistic term, which is the kind of, you cannot reduce to any of the parts. And it's really similar, right?
It's exactly
the synergistic term there looks like the third term in what Dennis was showing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And then he goes on to describe this kind of space. You get like a system and you start cutting, and you start like getting these atoms of irreducibility, and you kind of start to describe the structure that you have of this full whole based on what you lose depending on how the kind of local cut you do, right? So you start to infer the structure that wouldn't be available if you just observed passively the full system.
So it's beyond integrated information, because he's trying to come up with a linear description of the information that is synergistic to the system, right? So he doesn't want to reduce it to the parts, but he wants to treat the additional information as a part.
No, it's beyond, because a lot of emphasis has been given to just like this number integrated information, which would be phi, and he's just like which would be just the amount of loss as you lose. But he says you have lots of things that you have to characterize. There's not one single number that can characterize integrated information. You have to actually investigate all partitions. So if you want to get a good description of synergistic effects, you have to look at all partitions of it, So all ways of cutting the system, you can't lose as just one way to cut. So you have to cut it in all ways and see the way you, like every time what you lose, and then you get a bigger description of the system, which is, I mean, the integrated information theory already does that. It's more a rhetorical thing, I think.
Yeah, but it seems like these ways of cutting the system, they are like ways of investigating the space. And there's like this partition introduced on the space of, or the equivalence classes of types of information. So you have the redundant, the unique, and the synergistic. And then it's kind of like categorizing what falls under which type of information. But I think, yeah, this is exactly also how we can understand the move to spaces, right? Because spaces are a natural metaphor for like partitioning and slicing up a lot of information.
Yeah, so but I think that this language here actually is very useful, because one thing is to say that to reconstruct the separate maps, right? So that the equation is no longer an inequality. Is the additional term you're adding, let's say the synergistic term, right? Meaning its quality is to incorporate the surplus, right? As a term rather than as a relation, which was just, let's say, coded into the inequality, but not coded as an object, right? Or is it, let's say, restituting the parts so that the generative effect disappears? I think those are different. Let's say in the Merlin example, I mean, I actually got very confused when he chose the domino example as well, because it has the same effect. He says, I'm going to tell you about the two ingredients for generative effect. And then he says, to understand the two ingredients, let's think about a domino system, and let's change it in two ways, right? Imagine that the dominoes are really close, like they have some distance between them, each system. Now reduce the distance between the dominoes to the point that they are touching each other, right? Or even glued to each other. So that when I move one, the three move together, but not because one made the other move, but because they are the same object, right? Yeah, exactly, like that. They would still move, but it's not a cascade effect. So you lost something. Some condition was not met. And that would be the first condition, which is they must be separate systems and not one system. So that's the multiplicity condition, right? And then the second one, which is the weird one, is that now imagine that you're seeing them fall, separate systems are cascading, but somebody's hiding from you that there is a machinery behind it. And they're all glued to the machine that emulates the cascade. So they're like a toy at Disneyland, you know, like you want the children to see the dominoes falling, but you want to be able to put them back into place for the next section very, very quick.
I can't even imagine, but
something like that. And they just makes them fall.
Yeah.
They're actually falling separately, but for a bystander who doesn't see the orange thing, they are falling because one is touching on the other, right? So I mean, this is a good example, because this here in this second example, this is not even like it's a timed machine, right? C2, C3, right? Changing the states, and you see this through the veil as like an object hitting the other, hitting the other, hitting the other. So you don't see that these objects are actually tied together here in a different way, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't see the whole space of the system.
Yeah. So this here, this here doesn't make it possible, shows that you need multiple systems. and that this here, and this is where it gets a bit confusing for me, because I'm just trying to find the actual formulation. He says, this is in chapter 2, perhaps. I think it's the beginning of chapter 3. He says, yeah, conceive this mechanical device, so on. It's a time mechanical device. So we non-intentionally hides the part of the physical laws governing the whole setup when observing the domino. So this part here is hidden, right? So you only see these things separately touching on each other, but in fact, they are actually part of the same thing. Let me just erase my little drawing. Yeah, it's on the 3.1 point, it's 3.1.1. The first ingredient, the second one.
This one.
Yeah, so the first one is the multiple thing. Like if they were like glued together with no distance between them, you wouldn't have cascading effects. That's the first. And the second one is now conceive of the mechanical device binding them together in a hidden way, right? So the whole scheme consists of a timed mechanical device. And then he says, if you were to see the mechanical device, there would be no cascading effect as well.
Yeah.
Cascade effect, and then the last paragraph here. Cascade effects cannot be conjured without the interplay of multiple systems. However, interaction or interconnection of several systems only yields us an interconnected system. So the first condition of multiplicity only means they will interact. It doesn't mean that there will be anything generated. An interconnection theory by itself cannot explain interaction effects. Such effects only emerge when we conceal parts. When we observe the whole systems, the intuition disappears.
Yeah, this is important. Yeah.
But you see, like in this little example, it makes it seem like generative effects are superficial effects. If you could see the whole, you would see they don't exist. Like, which I understand if you treat it like, if you have a bit more sophisticated idea and you say that there is some, what counts, I mean, for example, what counts for one domino with regards to the other is just this effect for this constraint. So it is like inexact in the sense that the way that they're gluing together only respects some rule. So the combination of that rule or the general rule is the cascading effect. But sometimes it makes it seem like exactness is the same as reconstructing the mechanism behind. Right? Undoing the generative illusion, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the contagion example doesn't have that idea. Mm-hmm. Right? It makes no sense to talk about imagine that there is a machine behind it. Like the contagion effect, it seems like the generative product, the surplus, is truly generated by bringing together two systems. Like they had constraints, but the constraints of their conjunction, of their interconnection, yields different results than the conjunction of their separate constraints, right? So that's clearer without any hidden machinery. But in the two examples that he takes longer to explain, with the dominoes and with the magic, it seems like the generative effects are just like an effect of the lack of total information.
Yeah, I think it revolves around how you interpret this mechanism, this orange mechanism. When you recover the space or when you restore the equality again, right? Because the term is always like this right? Let's just use A plus B is not equal to, right, A plus B. And then now we're saying, okay, but let's add in the domino mechanism. Once you have the domino mechanism, this becomes equal again, right? But if we think of the domino mechanism not as getting rid of some hidden variable, hidden laws or something, or but as some
let's put it like this: you can be either a vulgar guy or well, it's also vulgar, but you can also be a Hegelian, because one thing is to say that the orange thing is the hidden essence behind the appearance, or you can say the orange thing is the essence of the appearance, right? A sort of supplement that gives body to the, let's say, to the being of what appeared, right? At first you look at what appeared and you say, I can't really grasp this added thing. It seems like it comes from nowhere, but you can actually give a form to the thing that came from nowhere, right?
Exactly. This thing is, and for all purposes, identical to gravity, right? To space-time. You know, like you can have many names for this. So
good point.
Right.
Yeah, that's actually what he says in between the lines, not in between the lines, but he says cascade effects would have emerged only with the veil. We can claim that the mechanical device is not a natural process. However, the physical laws of mechanics can be regarded themselves as the device.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So forget about the device. Just imagine that you call the device gravity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The device is any, in this case, it's some causal theory, but the theory can be, the theory of surplus value.
Yeah, because now it makes sense, because if you say this, you get a fight between the theory of value saying no, it's the gravity of the social world in capitalist reality that produced the surplus, or the capitalists to say no, guys, I had a hidden mechanism which was called capitalist motivation. That's what made the production fall, right? The dominoes fall. So those are two, let's say, representation of the surplus as object. One
exactly.
as a sort of kind of access to a more exact picture, right? And the other is, let's say, the addition of a thing that substitutes the exact picture, but gives you the equality anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It's competing theories that explain this third term. Yeah, you have like economics, the entire field of economics that can, supposedly consistently derive things without a theory of surplus value. Using individual preferences. Let's say you can derive like individual preferences as this machine here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just subjective, satisfying needs or whatever. That's what led the dominoes to fall, and that's actually a very common thing. Like the evil of individuals or the greed of individuals. That's what leads to the dominoes falling, and not. And actually, human nature, let's say, would be like this machine here, and not, you don't have to refer to some other theory then. But yeah, then the question is it really exact? And it's more complicated when you apply to the social world, the term exact.
But I think that my reason to say this is because we've been talking a lot about a theory of exactness connected to a theory of scaling, because the whole idea of resolution, right, is a theory of, let's say, the trade-off of exactness. Like, at which scale do you get the exact description? So, for example, a theory, if you see the dominoes falling and somebody unveils that the reason why they fell is a local one, right? It's suggesting that at the same level as a particular productive unit, you get all the information you need to understand how it behaves in that space. So you just add to the machinery and to the labor the sort of risk-taking and willingness of the capitalist, and that's the missing term. It's the local term, right? Or you can assume that the correct picture, the information we're interested actually concerns the totality. So that's not the right resolution. So in the same way that if somebody shows you the mechanics of the domino and says, this is why they fell, you will say, man, you're crazy. Like, gravity is not a local thing. You just added some steps, right? Because I still don't know why the mechanism was held to the table. Like, why did it stay below the dominoes? So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
right. So it kind of mimics a solution. It reminds me of a really good movie by Bergman that was actually an adaptation of a Chesterton play called The Magician, and I think the movie is also called The Magician, and it's about a guy who can do real magic, who can actually make things move in crazy ways, but nobody believes him because it's very subtle. So he adds tricks on top of the real magic. So he gets kind of dismystified. This was a trick. You were pretending to levitate something, but I opened the black box and I can see somebody was holding it. But somebody was holding it is just, let's say, a prop he made to make the thing more, to make his real magic more apparent, because people weren't really seeing that he was doing, like, he's able to levitate something like 1 centimeter above the ground, but nobody realizes that that's real levitation. So he made a trick to make it levitate 10 centimeters. When it is unveiled, people think that, so the whole 10 centimeters were a lie, but actually only 9 of the 10 were a lie and 1 was real.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
And I love the play is better than the movie, I think. So Chesterton was a bit too crazy, I think, for Bergman's kind of dispute of faith and crisis of faith. And there is no crisis of faith in Chesterton. It's something else. Yeah, I think I mean, the whole fact that we've been talking about this idea of scales and that there is the proper scale at which certain information is perceivable and at other scales it is not, right? This idea of finding the right covering and things like this, it might play a role here, even though it doesn't play for Adam so much, because, for example, you can have this, I think that's actually a good way, this is how I wanted to interpret what he's doing. Like, imagine that you have some system here, right? And it's infinitely rich, and you could, and like, you can cover it like this. So like a very small cover of its parts, and if you get the sum of these coverings, nothing happens. But now you substitute this covering for a bigger cover, like a covering that loses information, like it covers this, and then it covers this, and then it covers this, right? So it's a different cover for the same multiples, C line. And now you find an inequality. Like, so you could say that the move from C to C line, it's actually a veil, because you did change the resolution, right? Between, let's say, defining what counts as an atom. defining what counts as the minimal unit at which you perceive, or the resolution of the system, right? It's kind of like the knob you were talking about, like, but it's a knob for resolution, right? You can go from, let's say, kind of a one-to-one to a very coarse grain resolution, where you take, like, I don't know, infinity for one element, like the whole system, right? And there will be intermediate resolutions, for example, C-line, at which you will get an emergent effect. So if you take the resolution to be this one, the inequality appears. If you take it to be a lower one, closer to the one-to-one, then it doesn't appear. Right?
Yeah, I really like this. Yeah.
This is a way of thinking about what he calls phenomena. And this is what Badiou calls atomic logic, right? The definition of like, if you take the veiling to be abstraction, as I suggested, like to be the definition of the predicates that capture the appropriate information to be able to define the uniqueness of that space, right? So for Badiou, this function here, which actually has the same, I know it's the phenomenal component one. It's like this, right? So this phenomenal component here, and for Badiou there is no ground C, right? I mean, I think the general one would be just S itself, meaning belonging. With belonging, you can get just the singletons for all the infinite elements, right? But you can change properties for other properties, which will bring together different things under the same group, right? And if you find properties that define unique atoms and allow for compatibility between the things, right? They are, let's say, stable resolutions of that system. So there might be another one. So for example, you can say that C here this one here was like looking at a cat as the sum of a bunch of molecules and atoms. This other resolution is looking at a cat as a sum of legs and a tail and a face and fur, right? And you can have a different one here, which takes the cat as a single object. It is actually part of the house. You don't decompose the cat. It's like you're just listing stuff in the house, living things, like objects and things like this, right? So these are different resolutions. The good ones are the ones that respect these things, because they allow you to glue a whole world, a whole cohesive vision of everything at that level. So if you choose that atom, you're able to localize stuff at that level, right? Now, what I think, from what I understand, what I think that Adam is doing that is really amazing is to say it's okay to imagine that different resolutions will have different generative effects. Like you can perhaps now at this big broad resolution here, it takes very big views of these multiples. Again, you have the sum is the same, right? So you need to, let's say, you need to allow yourself to be mistaken, or you need to choose a certain veiled resolution, a certain abstraction level to make the effect appear. If you go too low or too high, the effect disappears. Now, it's not because you suddenly arrived at the best description. It might not be the best if you're interested in the generative effect, right? So for example, the capitalist in our example, he wants the covering of the space to be smaller than what interests us. So he's not interested in the description of total surplus production. He's interested in the description where the predicates apply to individual producers. So he takes a system of production like this. For example, you have here a productive unit, you have here another productive unit, and he says the right way to talk about this is one where you only get, let's say, this sort of predicates, right? Capitalists, workers, managers, my money, this and that, like those ways of describing things. Whereas Marx is doing like this, talking about departments, total social production, like we're at a higher level of description. We're not at the same level. The predicates are different. The atoms of the capitalist world are not visible from the site of production, right? That's a sort of solution to the problem of either circulation or production for the surplus production. Like surplus can't be located inside or outside because the scale at which it appears includes circulation. So it's a higher scale, but still from that scale looking into production, right?
Yeah, and in that sense, the transformation problem is people, like, it's the question of whether one scale could be reduced to the other, or if from Marx's scale we could translate it back down to the local scale.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm imagining. Like let's imagine like this, okay? So there is a resolution one that maps this system in such a way that the sum of all these connections is the same, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing is produced. This is, let's say, the immediate resolution of individuals, so to speak. Now you get a second resolution, which is, let's say, the value analysis, which analyzes this system, and the sum of the effects at this resolution is distinct from the analysis of the parts. So we get that inequality, right? Somehow, I don't know how I'm writing this. Now, there is a third thing, which is finding a resolution, which you want to do two things. You want to preserve this and go back to one, right? Mm-hmm. So the capitalist is not happy with this, where equivalents are exchanged for equivalents. It doesn't make sense for him. But he's also not happy with this different resolution, which allows surplus to appear. We're able to talk about its appearance, and we can see that something emerges. So we're looking from further out. We zoomed out. But the guy now wants to zoom back in while keeping the inequality, right? So I think that's what you said. Like in a third resolution of the system, you want to add like, so I don't know, there's something about this. I'm not sure exactly how I would frame it, but it's a way of talking about the transformation problem also in this sense, right? But the basic thing that I wanted to bring to the discussion is that I think that a good way to think about this is in terms of not veils between me and others, but different resolutions of a system. So you have a system of systems, right? A universal, I don't know how it calls it. And we can talk about the veilings as different ways to partition the system. So we don't need to imagine some guy here looking. It's this idea of a guy looking, this is an I, I'm sorry, is just standing for the fact that a same system can be analyzed by taking parts like this, being partitioned like this, or can be partitioned like this, right? Mm-hmm. All of them kind of preserve the idea of ordering and the idea of, I mean, most of them preserve, and if they're good ways of partitioning, they will preserve the gluing conditions as well. But there might be many ways of doing this, you know, like this. And the way I understand the good insight of Adam is that this third resolution, this second resolution, and this third one, they might actually yield some kind of make an inequality appear, and others don't. you know? Like, so I think that's a nice theory because it suggests that, let's say, it goes with that intuition that fetishism is not about mystification for a perceiver, for an observator, but it's the objective place at which you need to put yourself to see capitalist reality. Like the predicative structure that makes capitalism apparent is not the same as your own resolution. It's not the same as your scale, right? So when you look at things in a factory, you need to put yourself in the position where you see commodities relating and you see labor as commodity to see, let's say, the dynamic structure appear. If you try to look at things as objects, as use values, as things produced by laborers, you don't see the connection, right? So different resolutions might give you more information than lower resolutions or things like this. But what I think that he adds is not simply that resolutions can add more information, but also that resolutions can add uneven information, right? Between causes and effects or something like this.
Mhm.
I don't know. I mean, I just think that this is something to try to, like, this is a different way of approaching that I think makes his developments more connected to how we've been discussing. Because then the whole issue of, oh, but isn't there a ground view, an absolute view where everything is at its proper resolution, therefore in full HD, right? No bits missing.
No loss, yeah.
No loss. And I think that we don't need that assumption, like that ontological assumption that no loss exists. It's actually unneeded. Like you can imagine I mean, you can turn it into a pragmatic question, like exact information with regards to what, right?
Yes, always relative to what phenomena you're trying to
exactly. I mean,
see. Yeah.
I mean, that's perhaps is what doesn't make it into more objective phenomenology for him, because sure, it's availing from, under what conditions is that avail, right? For different purposes, it might not be. I mean, the only place where he makes that claim a bit is in the example of Arthur, when he talks about expectation. He says, the veil on the trick is Arthur's inability to observe everything. The veil causes magic to emerge, but there is also an underlying ingredient, that of Merlin performing the trick and Arthur building expectation. The trick is seems to consist of several small pieces of tricks combined. The big trick is performed by combining or interconnecting the small pieces tricks, causing them to interact. The magic emerges as follows. Arthur recognizes the small tricks and creates an expectation of what each ought to perform. On one end, he combines the small tricks devoid of magically, namely his small expectations, and builds a big expectation on the whole trick. On the other end, he observes the final development of Merlin's trick, and he compares the big expectation to the outcome of Merlin's trick. If there is a discrepancy, there is magic. So magic is not a function of veil and system. Magic is a function of expectation and veil, right? I see one thing, I see the other, I expect a third, but the conjunction of those two doesn't lead to the third one I expected, leads to something else. So that's a more pragmatic definition of resolution, right? Arthur sees this, sees that, he thinks that he captured the language at which things are happening. So he thinks he understood it, like a commodity is exchanged for money according to an equivalence. Money is exchanged back to another commodity according to equivalence. He expects that all value exchange is equivalent, but the production site emerges more value. And then he's kind of, I mean, that's actually exactly how Marx introduces it. Like, we are perplexed. Like, how is it possible that something more appears, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, I mean, you know, remember The Prestige? That's exactly how The Prestige works, that movie. I love that movie.
Yeah, it's an amazing movie.
Because it has that, like, they divide like that, right? There is I forgot the names of the three movements of magic. It's yeah, fuck. There's like the preparation, then the second moment, and the third. And Zizek has a good text where he compares the production of surplus value exactly to the trick in the Prestige, because the guy puts actually, this is an even better example. Like, there is a cage with a bird inside, right? I don't know how to draw a bird. So you see this. Then the second moment, he veils it and presses on it, right? So the veil is like this on the stand. And then the third moment, which is the reveal, which is to show the cage again, right? And the bird is alive. And then the point, of course, is that a bird died here, right?
Yeah, fell under the.
Yeah, and you remember
trap,
the scene in the movie, like the kid sees this and he starts crying. Like, he showed this trick to a child, and the child sees the first part, then the second part, and then the third part, and then he starts weeping, and the magician shows him the bird, and he says, but this is not the same bird. And the magician is like, oh my God, this child is amazing. And then Zizek says, yeah, but this is kind of what happens in surplus production. Like, the workers here, dead below, but then you have like this surplus produced on the other side. But the reason why I mentioned it is just because there is one thing in this movie that I find genius, which is, I mean, this is a big spoiler for people who didn't see it, but he does this other trick where there is a door, other door here. And the guy drops a ball, enters into this door. The door doesn't have anything. It's like on a stage, right? Then the ball is kicking, and then he exits through this other door and picks up the ball. And like, everyone is like, crazy. How did he go from here to here? It's impossible, right? And then the other magician who hates him, he actually decides, he understands the trick in 2 seconds. He says, the only way that the magician could be here and then here is if there are 2 magicians, right? Magician 1 plus 2. But then he says, this is impossible because nobody would be this disciplined to live as if there's only one person when there's actually 2 people. So he says, this is not the solution. There must be another solution. And then he tries to come up with like a scientific machine of teletransportation to mimic the trick. But it's funny because he actually finds the solution. There is a double, but he cannot believe that this is the actual information. Like, the idea that this is how the trick is done is more incredible than if there is a teletransportation machine that allows the guy to go from one to the other. So he believes the teletransportation solution.
Yeah, it's like this orange thing. This is teleportation.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Versus discipline. Yeah.
Yeah, and then this is discipline. Yeah.
I always found that amazing. Like, the guy, and he tries it. He gets a double, the other magician, and he tries the trick with the other guy, but the other guy is paid, and the guy wants status and money, so he doesn't want to be the double. He wants to be a magician himself. So there is like organizational problem. And then he says, this is impossible. Like, this is less possible a solution than teletransportation.
Yeah, the idea that 2 people
can. Like, nothing is hidden. The idea that the guy is organized to the point that's what's hidden behind the veil is more, it's kind of out of the world. Like, he cannot accept. So he needs something else instead.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a perfect way to think about this third term. Like, yeah, there's 2 different, I mean, there can be different ways of thinking of this third term in a vulgar way and some more sophisticated way, let's say.
Yeah, I think it connects the idea of exactedness, right? To restore the exactedness of a system to the pragmatic point. Like, okay, but exactedness under what conditions, right? What are you accepting which is perfect information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because if you added to the magic just discipline, like the beginning of the movie, there is a Chinese guy who does a trick with a bowl with a fish. Like he walks into the stage with nothing, just a little stand, and then he's like very old and very kind of weak and kind of fat, and then he does like a gesture, and then there's a bowl of water with a fish inside, and everyone goes crazy. And then the magicians are looking at him after the show, and he leaves, and they say, "This is the trick. The trick was not what he did on stage. The trick is pretending he's weak and fragile all the time that he's in public. So people think it's impossible that he has the strength to put the bowl like between his legs and make it appear, right?" So, for example, for those magicians, it's a possible description of the world. A Chinese guy committed to magic all time of his life, and it's possible for them because they are like that. But for the audience, it's less likely that the guy is pretending, because they would never imagine that that's a possible description, right? Than to assume, I don't know, that it's a hologram or something, like a technological solution. So just to say that this is a good way of thinking about, you know, how different sizes of the world or different commitments to what is, let's say, the proper resolution at seeing the world should give you different exact descriptions, right?
Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah. Restoring exactness. It's actually not an exact concept. It has some degrees of, like some degrees of freedom there. Yeah.
Yeah. For example, you know that Twitter has this big debate now, like, is 2 + 2 = 4 or equal 5? Can 2 + 2 = 5? Like, and there is this mathematician who did a little simple drawing like this.
Yes, yeah, I saw this one. Yeah.
Showing that, sorry, no, it's like this, right? 2 + 2 equals like this. And then he says you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, the whole counts as one. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a different resolution, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the key.
Right. If your predicates only apply to this, then the solution is 4. You will only accept the solution 4. Though I think that it's not very simple, because then I wonder why he didn't accept that this is 1, this is 2, but it's squares, right? This will be a rectangle. But so for one language says squares of unit 1, and the other language says squares of any unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is also a possible square in a different base, so different bits, right?
Isn't it that this kind of similar also to that impossible triangle, like, and also to the Merlin trick, where you have like, you can follow the small tricks, like the guy is able to recognize all small tricks, and he thinks he's following when they are added, but then he creates an expectation of that, and then he sees the full trick, and then he gets like amazed. Like in the triangle, the effect is like when you follow with your eyes, like you try to find why is it wrong, and then you do that like locally, you follow the lines, they all make sense, right?
Yeah, true. Good example. Yeah.
We have like this, and
like this is correct, this is correct, this is correct, and it's only when you see this that you go like, what?
Yeah. And also like the rules of gluing, like in the pieces, they make sense in, like, if you consider like the kind of like a linear space, right? But if you then suddenly, and you have no reason why to expect that you need 3D space to glue these edges, It's only when you see globally and you see, oh, I need a 3D space from the beginning to actually make sense of that and see that it was impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like it puts all these examples kind of in the same.
Resolution. Yeah. Here the dimensions of your space act as a kind of resolution as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and since there is a correlation between, let's say, the structure of possible coverings and structure of the space, properties of the space, right? The moment that we force a certain gluing that only makes sense if a space is considered to have certain properties, suddenly you're looking at something in an impossible space, right? So there is some natural aspect to this, right? Like to think of it in terms of coverings of, or to say at which level the parts are being considered, right? And then that resolution is already, let's say, committing you to some properties of a space, right? It might seem like that resolution shouldn't, because you assume, like, I don't know, I forgot how that's called, like that the fact that you can all in a topological space, you can just kind of close a circle back to a point, right?
Deformation or
you like
contractible.
This sort of, this contractible property, right? Every circle, every closed loop can be contracted back to its 0 point. If it cannot, you get a different genus of the surface, right? So you assume that you can just take any resolution because it's always transitive. But I think that this inequality here is a good way of talking about the fact that it's not, right? I think one way to think about this is that resolutions are not always transitive. Like to adopt a certain resolution and then add stuff. So sorry, to see this and see this and then glue it together. So A at a certain resolution, B at a certain resolution, and then you glue it. Sorry, R and R. It's not the same as seeing it in a resolution where the two things are already glued, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there shouldn't be, this thing should be written differently, perhaps. But no, I think that this is a way, perhaps, to talk about.
I think, and this is where the pragmatics of this third object come into play, because rather than thinking of it as some kind of substantial part of the domain space, we should think of it as the way of connecting the resolutions. Like you said, that this is if this is resolution 1, and then this is resolution 2, right? Where you have individual systems, and then you add them, and then you have the resolution 1 where you see the already completed thing. This links resolution 1 with resolution 2. This is the connection.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be some substantial thing. I mean, it can be a more formal thing, right?
Yeah, man, but this is really useful because, the very fact, I mean, it just confirms what we were talking about, right? That in this equation here, something is coded as the inequality, right?
Yeah.
It's coded into it. It's part of it as a relation. It doesn't have a sort of fixed presentation. And this thing here is, let's say, the coding of that relation as an object, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, distribution of a total average, it's very much this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Getting, let's say, the total sum of surplus of this differential, right? And then spreading it out as a certain rate that you add back to the equation to make it equalize.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, there are some steps there, I don't know, but it seems very much in line with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, maybe we can just finish the last 3 slides to talk about this linking sequence, right? So first of all, the reason we introduced linear algebra again is because to calculate a linking sequence, you need linearity, at least the way that Adam does it, right? So the language of linear algebra and vector spaces, this is where you can actually calculate things. However, most phenomena are not linear. So that's where things like algebraic topology and algebraic geometry come into play, because we can actually, there are ways we can turn nonlinear problems into linear problems. Okay, and I didn't get far enough to give a clear example of that, but later on in the text, he does this using cohomology. And then also he points out an interesting example of logic, as you can have generative effects on logic in terms of inference rules and statements. So if I say, we can interpret the S's as being a set of statements that are true, right? So I say, X is true, Y is true, Z is true, and so on. And then this one is S2 is, A is true, B is true, C is true. So the conjunction, so let's say we have an operator that gives us the set of derivable statements. So if A is true, then B is true, right? So we say the operator here takes all the statements in S1 and gives us the set of derivable statements, right? And clearly we can think of an example where the conjunction of these two is not equal to this, right? I guess I'll use union here because it's a set of statements. And why is that? Because the set of things I can derive from S1 and S2 here doesn't count statements that are derived from a combination of the two, right? So I can use theorems and examples from 2 different fields, let's say, to derive my theorem. Let's say I can use things from both on this side here, but I can't on this side. So that's another example of.
This really reminds me of Lautmann, because Lautmann had this idea he called mathematical mixtures. He says mathematics is the crazy thing about mathematics is everything is homogeneous, everything is made of formal systems, but the conjunction of formal systems like algebraic geometry or even mathematical logic, like those are not tautological, right? So the mixture of logics and mathematics or algebra and geometry doesn't give back to you all the statements you knew in algebra and the statements you knew in geometry, like just corresponding them. Like, for example, like basic stuff like Boole did, right? Showing that you can treat implication as a sort of inclusion. Or so A belongs to B, B belongs to C, therefore A belongs to C, right? And he says, but this is kind of what we mean by transitivity and implication. If A, then B, if B, then C, therefore, if A, then C. But you don't get a tautology. It doesn't mean that the more, let's say, set theoretic version and the logical version, they are nearly equivalent. You might be able to prove things in a space where logic is treated in this way that you wouldn't be able to prove just by talking through implications or by describing sets. Yeah. Right. So the space of a theory separate. So the properties you can produce of in geometry, and the propositions you can produce in algebra, they are not the same as the propositions you can produce in algebraic geometry, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
So for him, this is, let's say, the basis of formal dialectics, like dialectics in formal sciences. The fact that mixtures of formal systems can produce statements that the separate systems wouldn't be able to produce.
Yeah, and you can kind of think of category theory from that light as one of what Apolito calls the mechanism of connectivity, right? It's a way of increasing the connections between different mathematical fields so that you can exploit this difference to produce a lot more these cross field interactions.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like it's the first field that actually, let's say, turned that sort of in an equal relation into an object of the theory, right? Mappings themselves are objects. So the mapping between two systems is not extra formal. It's the very thing being formalized. One thing that really interests me I'll ask later. All this beautiful. And you're becoming like the master of these presentations.
I really enjoy it now. Yeah, it's it's kind of fun. It's just like drawing pictures, and then I have to figure out if it's rigorous at all. And just two more slides, just to get an intuition for space. Basically, what we were just saying, algebras and spaces. We can actually come up with a formalism for describing manipulation of spaces, which is algebraic topology, and we can use this to calculate this object, this C. Basically, it's a cohomology of the space. But I didn't really get far enough to go very deep into this. But just as an example, we can glue points together by identifying them. So you can think about this operation of a horizontal bar as being the gluing of all these points to a single point, right? So when I say x over a or x mod a, I'm saying count all this pink stuff as the same, right? And then I can also say add two spaces together, and then count these. I can then count these 2 points together, so that creates this. Right. So first, consider the space including both of these spaces, which they're not connected yet. But then I just say that these 2 points are the same. So then that leads to a gluing of this. And in general, I can glue any space to any other space by this method of choosing some points in one space and some points in the other, and doing this quotient operation to them. So this is how we can inductively build spaces. And then this is actually kind of a little more complicated, but it's a way of attaching algebraic objects onto a space. So I define 3 spaces here. C0, which is the set of all points. Actually, in this case, we'll say it's y minus x, so it's only the point y. C1 is the free group of cycles. So a cycle would be a loop in this space. So it would be something like going from x, following b to y, and then back reversing through c back to x. And we can write these cycles as in an algebraic format, like b negative 1c, like that. Or actually even simpler, we don't need the parentheses. Just say b minus c. And why is it minus? Because C has an orientation, right?
Mhm.
It goes from X to Y. So if I want to go follow B, and then I want to go back, I want to go against the direction of C, I'll take the negative there, right? So when I say the free group of cycles in C1, I'm saying all loops that you can make with combinations of these things. So you can actually add in a coefficient here. So 3B minus C means go along B and then back along C and do that 3 times, right? So that's this motion, right? 1, 2, 3, right? That's the same as this. And then the free group just means all possible combinations. So this number can be anything. So let's just give it a variable, right? And then not only that, but now I can combine like A minus D as well. So A minus D. And again, I can pick arbitrary number of coefficients, as long as actually it has to be such that K plus J is equal to 0, I think. So that no matter what, I always end back at X. Something like that. So there's some, let's say, we don't need to go specifics into the calculation, but there are some conditions such that I can derive an algebra of cycles from this graph, right? From on C1. And then C2 is all the cycles generated by the shaded area. So specifically, it's just all the possible A to B, sorry, A minus B's. So like A minus B, and then K again. K is just it can be up to infinity, right? Right, because this A minus B means this thing here, this loop. That is a boundary of A. Okay, so homology is it's a way of characterizing this space X. The whole point is I want a number, or let's say I want a algebraic structure that I can assign to this space that will remain invariant despite whatever kind of stretching or rearranging that I want to do to the space. So it remains invariant. It kind of characterizes the space among all other spaces, right? Although I will say that it doesn't do this completely. There is some, right? Like it's possible that two spaces that are different end up having the same homology, but yeah, I mean, this is still to some degree separates the space from others, right? And that's still an open problem in topology, how to find all the topological invariants to uniquely characterize every space. That's so far, we can't do that. But this is one. Yeah, it's a no-go, but this is one kind of invariant. And the way we describe this invariant is the kernel of the boundary map divided by, so the kernel of this boundary map divided by, or quotiented by, the image of this boundary map, right? So that's what homology is. And then we kind of visited kernel and image, right? If you remember from this picture here, the kernel is this white map. The image is this green map. So to divide them is kind of saying like, what is the ratio, or actually what does the space look like if you were to glue the green space together and leave the white space, something like that. Or, yeah, maybe you say the ratio between the white space and the green space. With respect to these things, the space of these things. Okay, and one step further from this is cohomology, which reverses the direction of the arrows, which I didn't prepare an example for that. But if you just imagine, instead of boundary maps, and I haven't explained what these maps are, but you just imagine maps going the other way. This would have an associated invariant for cohomology. I think it's written with asterisk here, but I'm not sure. Anyway, this cohomology is what this third object is.
Dude, I just realized, I mean, I know you're gonna think I'm just pushing like that one button that we've been pressing for 10 years, but isn't this like the perfect stuff to formalize logical time in Lacan? Like,
yeah,
because
maybe.
I mean, just think about it. Like, the whole point is that, I mean, to sum it up, is that you can extract information out of the hesitation of others, right? You don't know something about yourself. You're seeing the white discs in the others. Then you try to arrive at your conclusion directly from them. So you don't include yourself in your reasoning, only them. You say, they are looking at me, and if they were seeing that I was black, one of them would be seeing a white and a black, and he would leave. So that's not happening. So they're not seeing a black. So they must be seeing a white. I'm a white, and I leave.
Yeah.
But then there is a second problem, which is, but this also would be valid for a second person, right? Why is the second person left? No, so yeah, so they are not seeing. How does it go? I forget.
Yeah, you see two whites, and then if, let's say you're A, and you see B and C, right? B and C are both white.
Yeah. So I assume, yeah.
And yeah, you say, well, since there's 3 white discs and 2 black discs, if I have a black disc, they're gonna know immediately. Well, they won't know immediately. Let's just say what happens is I think I have a black disc. I cannot see my own disc, so I have to infer, okay, I might have a black disc. If I have a black disc, then B will think the case is, B will think, oh, I see a white and a black. So if I have a black disc, C must go immediately.
Yeah.
Right? Right? So if I'm going to wait and see, actually, it's funny because both B and C think the same thing, right? If I'm black.
Dude, here, just let me just share this because I just found this thing with it. Okay. I think it will help.
Yes.
Remember this thing?
It may help, or it may just not help at all.
No, but just because I think it goes through what, I mean, it just has more space to say what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Black hypothesizes on this line 2.1. If I'm black, then B will start to think something, right? And the arrows pointing down means
yeah,
it's another level of the thinking, right?
Yeah, I assume that this is like, if I'm black, then B is looking at me and thinking, if I'm black, then C would leave, because C would be seeing two blacks, and C would know if two blacks, then I'm white. Right?
Mhm.
Oh, sorry, just 1 second. And then I say, well, if neither, so, but B would say, if I'm black, C would leave, but C doesn't leave, so B would conclude that C must be seeing a white and a black. But since I know if A is black and C didn't leave, then B is black. And he would leave, right? If he doesn't leave,
B would leave. Yeah, B would leave because now he knows both B and C would figure out that they can go because the other didn't leave.
Yeah, exactly. And then but then I say, well, if B didn't leave, B and C didn't leave, then I must be white, right? And then there is this moment where it's always a big problem, which is this is not a direct conclusion because this is actually suspended information, right? Because how do you know that this moment ended?
Exactly. Yeah, it all turns on the question of what counts as a hesitation here.
Yeah,
a valid hesitation. It's a negative thing.
Exactly, and you have this weird ambiguity, right? I can call it a logical ambiguity, and you move from, let's say, waiting for them to move to realize that your movement is actually what's going to define what we call the temps de battement, right? The how much hesitation counts as a moment, right?
Yeah.
But I just realized that this is relevant because you need to, like, the information you want doesn't come from the analysis of the parts, right? There's nothing you can do by analyzing this to arrive at the fact that you're white. Mm-hmm. Like, you need to actually take these two things together, and then you get to this point, and then you need to take these three things together, and then you arrive at your information. And then Lacan said that he doesn't want you to give this solution. He wants the solution that is the exact sequence, right? Remember, he gives two versions of the solution.
Yeah, he gives one that's in the sense of like impersonal.
Yeah.
An impersonal solution where you say one must go if they see two whites, then like it's said in this impersonal way, and then another solution is said in a personal way, like if I am white, this must be true, something like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it is, let's say, where did the information about you being a white circle come from, right? It didn't come from the analysis of this or this, right? It comes from this weird conjunction. I mean, there is a certain sense, it's my point, like there is a certain sense in which the logical time sophism is kind of about how you get to see yourself from another perspective, which is not the perspective of a other, right? Like the first attempt at solving it is by taking the position of a given other. Like you try to look at from the other's perspective and think how the other would reason, but that is necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? Because the other would also not have reason to move. So if you just combine the reasonings together, you don't get the full solution, but there is a certain common denominator between the three that is actually generates the solution.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree it's an interactional effect, but I'm not sure I see a connection with the homology and the spaces thing.
No, not with the homology in the space. It's just with the
okay.
the exact the additional term,
Right.
which is not really part of the generating of the effect. But once the effect was generated, you can reconstruct the third one. Like
Yes.
I remember it because we were not in this slide, but in the old one, right? The one with the 3 terms.
But the additional term, isn't it the addition of the other ones, or not? Or you think it's the whole thing?
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. Like this third term here, this is a reasoning that makes the solution exact.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
But this third term is only possible after this. Only after you conclude, this is where the conclusion comes. The moment to conclude. Only after it comes can you add this. Can you calculate the exact solution? You didn't move because you had this, right?
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't come first.
Yeah, this is why it's anticipated certainty.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
So there is something, I don't know, there's something to this way of, like, to this inequality we were talking about that seems to me relevant here. Like, if you think about the reasoning, right? Isn't the solution kind of like this? The fact that the reasoning that includes A, B, and C is different from the reasoning of A plus the reasoning of B plus the reasoning of C, right? But it is made equivalent if you add here this solution, which is not really possible from the beginning. Like, the system only has these 3 things available, right? This reasoning is totally impossible before you move. So first you have these 3 reasonings, then you have the move to this solution, to the moment of conclusion, and then you get this precipitation of the solution. But the actual reasoning of the solution can only come after the generative effect.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. I think,
and I mean, I actually think we can take this further, because if we analyze the way that the prisoner needs to come up with this reasoning of A, B, and C, it is kind of like removing the discrepancy, right? You do get something like the common denominator between the 3, rather than the discrete. Like, you don't move because somebody has better information than others. Like, the solution is a consequence of nobody having better information than anyone else. That is an added information, right?
mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think that there might be a second round of logical time investigation.
Yeah. Another 10 years of
obsessing over this.
Yeah, I like this. Yeah, because you can think of Badiou's reading of logical time also as being like a positivization of this loss of information, right? Like, for Badiou, he derives the idea that the other 2 could be idiots, or like the reason they're hesitating is because they're just too slow. They're not really, and I can use that fact to my advantage and just go, something like that.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, he says that the problem with Lacan is that he requires the presupposition that the 3 are identical logical machines. No, sorry, that if the 3 were identical logical machines, that wouldn't be possible. He says, I have the text here. He says, he divides it into 3 reasonings, right? The reasoning 1, I see 2 black disks. He even uses this idea that one is included in the other, right? He says there are 3 reasonings according to the 3 premises that are virtually possible. The first reasoning, I see 2 black disks. Now, there are only 2 black disks, therefore I'm white. This reasoning would be immediate. It's the time of the glance, but that's not the case. The second reasoning, I see one black and one white. If I am black, the other white sees two blacks. Therefore, he reasons from the start according to reasoning 1. Right? So if I'm doing reasoning 2, the other can do reasoning 1 and leave. He didn't, so I'm not black. And then he says, it is by assuming that the other will accomplish the reasoning 1, whose intuitive brilliance I am able to invoke, that I infer that he should have left the room. Then reasoning 3, I see two whites, I am black, the others see one black and one white. They must reason from the start according to R2. They should have concluded. If they have not left, I am white. Again, I reason according to R3, that the others reason according to R2. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, he does it in this way. It's like reason 1. Is there a reason 0?
No.
No, right. Reason 1 is two blacks, one white.
Yeah.
Reason 2 is
two whites and one black.
Two whites, one black.
Meaning that there is, for someone, if I were black, right? If I reason according to R2, the others might reason according to the first and leave.
Yes, exactly. Yes, R2 plus R1 leads to a solution. And then R3, yeah, I think it's like R3 it just happens because R2 doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Like if you basically like negation of R2, then R3, something like that.
Yeah. And then, but Badiou's point is that that the model that Lacan uses doesn't explain the thing he wants. So he says that under this presupposition that all of them reason according to the same speed because they're just like computing it as logical machines. Under this presupposition, the reasoning R3 is entirely conclusive, given the fact that if the other reasoned according to R2, he would started moving before I finished R3. Right? It takes less time to reason according to R2 than it takes to reason according to R3.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's still thinking, he is in the same reasoning as me, because other reasonings take less time than my reasoning. By contrast, the fact that the other does not move except when I do cannot lead me to doubt. It indicates, it kind of confirms that he was reasoning according to R3. As a result, my conclusion, which is already certain, is purely and simply confirmed. Surplus certainty and not suspended doubt. Therefore, there must be something Lacan doesn't say. The silent supplement is precisely the point where, in order to cross the temporal topology and the algebra of calculation, again, we're in the space of algebraic topology, in order to account for haste, it's necessary to posit that the heterogeneity of force exceeds the connection of places, right? So the whole, there is a problem of neighborhoods and not only a problem of like the only way that haste is relevant here is if you cannot be sure of the exact sequence before you move, right? The exact sequence can only be produced afterwards. Otherwise, no haste was needed.
Yeah, I think this is a nice way of thinking. So interactional effects plus time, right? Or time as interactional.
Yeah, because I mean it goes with the way that you described it in the addition you made to the previous slide, where you had like this with A and B, and then sorry, it's not like this, right? It's C. It's C, right? And we said It's like this is in a resolution 1, this is in a resolution 2, and this here, it does this, right?
Mm-hmm.
It connects the two.
Connects them. Yeah.
The way that he's saying is that Lacan is actually treating this as something that happens before this. Like, I see the guy reasoning, I see the other reasoning, this leads me to this, and then I move. And Badiou is saying that you actually see this and this, you see the limits of this. This leads you to move under the conviction that later on you can come up with the solution. Right? For him, haste includes the conviction that there will be space for you to come up with a solution that includes the fact that you move. Because I mean, he wants to introduce. I mean, he wants to add to the logical time the dimension of kind of ungrounded action, right? Whereas Lacan gives a sort of haste as a determination, not haste as a kind of action itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the anxiety and the courage thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Two different readings of that.
So I mean, I know that this is a bit too kind of loose, but it's nice because it actually plays into what we were talking about. Like,
yeah,
depending on a certain pragmatic of these resolutions, you know, the complement that makes the equation exact can actually be different, right? That's kind of the conviction for what Badiou calls courage in his reading. Like, you can come up, you can move, and then there will still be space for you to add this, taking into consideration this relation, right? This resolution. You don't need to be determined to move. You can actually do it in the inverse. I don't know. There's something to it. I don't know. I might be going off here, but
no, I like it. Yeah, and because in some sense, there's a set of choices that can be made afterwards. Like, if you move, you can use this third term as like a justification or something. Yeah. After the fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's very abstract now.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll sleep on it, but I think that there is something to the way, like, we might be able to kind of reconstruct this chains of reasoning as a sort of lattice structure.
Yeah, it's true.
And then discuss the partitions of it, you know, and show that, weirdly enough, like, there is a larger way of partitioning where the reasoning of A, B, and C are included in one part. That is actually, you know, the proper resolution to get a solution, whereas the separate ones don't. Because it's weird, like, we discussed this, I remember discussing this a lot, right? That the failure of these reasonings are ways that you get more and more indistinguished with the other. Like, the more a reasoning fails, the more similar to the others you are, the more you think with the head of the others, right? So there is a certain process of union of this reasoning, right? Like, ultimately, what allows you to move is the understanding that there is a sort of, that the only available reasoning is shared by the tree, right? So I don't know. I think there's something to. We might be able to do something after all this time with this.
Yeah, I agree. The reasoning of all three together isn't found in the previous two. It has to be here, right? It's like there's some kind of conjoined reasoning here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because I mean, the thing that I think always kind of was very seductive and very kind of enigmatic and made it interesting for us in Pensée and then the circle with logical time is that the source of the solution, it comes from a mixture of the community, like the collection of the tree, But that collection is bound together by the failure to reason, not by the successful reasoning, right?
Mm.
If any of the three were successful in their reasonings, they would be different. One would have moved and the others would have lagged behind. It's because nobody has the solution that they are collectivity, and because they are collectives that they know a solution, right? So you actually have this sort of imputation of reasoning to the other. This fails, you fall in the same pot as the other. You're obliged to treat yourself as the other, right? Or to say that the only thing you know is that you're reasoning like the other, even if you don't know your own reasoning. And this turns out to be the basis for the solution, right? So you think that you're gonna add reasonings to arrive at a solution, but you're actually taking the union of the reasonings.
Yeah.
Something like this. But
Yeah, something.
So, or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to stop.
Yeah,
We can,
man, but thank you so much. This was really, really enlightening.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Good discussions.
By the way, I wonder, Hansel, would you be up for? I mean, since we quickly went into the whole thing with the partitioning of integrated, like, would you be up to do a presentation next time?
Yes, I think like in how much time?
It can be like in either next week or 15 days, whatever you prefer.
I think 15 days is better.
For me, it works. Because and I'm planning to I was wondering if I should try to do something like with the basic stuff from the Bogdanov book, or if I should try to like summarize the stuff we already discussed from like the Karatani group. But I try to kind of bring one of those two things also in the near future.
On the other hand,
Bogdanov is good.
I could do it in a little bit later because I have some stuff I have to deliver, like my project and.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
No, perhaps I can take the next one and then you take one after that. So you're.
Yeah, that would be good
sure.
for me.
We can talk through the WhatsApp group and just see where we want to move from here. I mean, I'll just suggest some stuff and we see what fits better. Anyway,
it would
guys,
be nice to know just one last thing: the question of Bogdanov, how it differs from like general systems theory, which I think Adam is kind of using, right? Or he uses this Willems guy who is like
but it's funny
systems.
because but it's funny because Adam seems to be part of this big trend in applied category theory of showing that category theory is better to think these things than systems theory, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that and I think that you can see this here because he has a very natural concept of space of systems that you don't need to. I mean, you don't need to think about interacting systems. I mean, systems are not necessarily let's say the totality concept. They can be either a totality or the part. You can move very easily between those two things, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a more natural language to talk about. I mean, one of the surprising things for me in his book is that in his dissertation is that he makes many times the point like, guys, stop associating generativity with nonlinearity. Like, he makes this point right at the beginning, which I think is very, very profound. Like, I'm not even sure if I think if he knew how profound it was, I think he would probably say more about it. Because he says, on page 24, we introduced the idea of linearizing generative effects. Cascading phenomena do not occur from nonlinearities. In fact, they are completely orthogonal to them. So generativity and cascading effects, they're not, let's say, a consequence of nonlinearity, which I think in common sense, that's how you think about it. Like, if a system has the property of nonlinearity, then generative effects are possible. And he's saying that generative processes are actually orthogonal to it. Like, sure, nonlinearity might play a role in a certain interaction, but since the interaction between systems is a privilege point, and the veiling, if the system is a linear or non-linear, it doesn't really constrain the possibility, right?
Yeah, you can still produce that inequality.
Exactly.
That's the key. Yeah.
So the idea that this inequality doesn't stem from nonlinearity, I think it's something that goes a bit against more like classical discussions that, oh, if you want to talk about surplus, if you want to talk about emergent properties, you need to adopt a dynamic perspective, right? So, but the problem of a dynamic perspective is that you need to presuppose a bunch of stuff. Like, you need to, first of all, you need a theory of time that is not a product of a system, but is where the system is based, right? So you need to think about temporality as a given, and then you talk about the movement of something. You can't really have deduce the temporality from inside. So in this case here, generativity has nothing to do, I mean, for example, our idea of scalar effects. Changing resolutions can change if there is a generative effect or not. That changing resolution is not really a change in temporality. Like, you can have something that is quite static, like we were talking about with the little cubes, like 2 cubes plus other 2 cubes give actually 5 cubes rather than 4. There is no, it's not a development in generative in that sense of temporal disclosure, right? So you kind of uncouple things that I think are in systems theory a bit more connected. Like, you tend to presuppose dynamics and temporality and a bunch of stuff, and here you can ask those questions more separately. I think that's a really big reason why this sort of compositional approach, right? It's always about the sort of mappings, and it tends to treat the problem in a more pure form, I think. And I think that really is similar to Bogdanov, because for him, the whole point is talking about the connection between systems. Like, his original thesis is about how systems interact and not how systems develop on their own. That's like the primitive picture, you know. I don't know. I might try to prepare something for next week on this then.
Yeah, that would be great.
Cool, guys.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, nice long meeting.
Hey guys,
see you
later.
in a week or two. Yeah, take care.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, guys.